Hello, welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are continuing on with Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, starting with chapter 16. But first, reading updates. I am still reading Witchcraft. I'm still reading it. I'm enjoying it. I just finished the first part. So it's divided into three parts. The first part deals with demonology and why that instigated witch hunts. The second part moves away from demonology. I'm not quite sure what the focus is. And then the third part is present day, focusing in North America and South America. And something that I really like is, at least for the first part so far, it has been like chronological and going in different places. So a lot of different places in mostly Europe, and it's very interesting. And it also has a thorough line of like, this case was the basis for this case, and the evidence used in this one was used as, a reason for this trial. So it's very interesting. Scary times, but very interesting. And I'm really liking it. It comes out the 16th. That's all I'm reading right now. I have to read much faster though, because I have like 5 books checked out from the library, and one of them, a couple of them are coming due. One of them is due a couple days ago, and there's a hold for it. And I feel terrible, but I'm one of those people where it's like, I need to hold on to this. I can't give it up. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Go about your business. I am watching, so it might be a surprise to people, but I've been watching anime. I know. I know it's very surprising. And my current obsession is the show Blue Lock. It's so stinking good. It's about this it's about these soccer players in Japan, and they have all been picked to be part of this like experiment to find the best striker that would join the national team for Japan. And it is so dramatic and so good. And I know the concept might sound so dumb. This is the first like sports anime that I've watched, and I don't know what the other ones are like, but this one is just, it's so good. It's so good, and it's like dark and just so, the drama is 1,000%, like all the time, but I love it so, so much. So I've been watching that, and I don't know if it still is, but it was the number one anime in Japan, and it was like, well, what's this? And it's so good. Okay, I'm done. Not to oversell it or anything. Anything else? Oh, I'm halfway through a movie right now. John Wick. I know. I'm very behind. Shiny, you say? I'm very behind, but I have not watched any of the John Wick movies, and I'm watching the first one, and it is nonstop action. It is nonstop action. I know I'm the first one to say this, but it's pretty good. I'm only halfway through, so I still have like 45 minutes left. But I had to get ready for today because Wuthering Heights. What a great segue, right? It's like I planned it. It's almost like I planned it. So, today we're reading Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, starting with chapter 16. What happened last time? Well, okay. Let's see if I can remember like where it starts. Probably not, but that's okay. Um I'm trying so hard to think of like a good way to do it without sounding so crazy, like that meme with like Charlie Day trying to explain something with the mailroom. That's exactly what's going on in my brain right now. Okay, so Isabella, who is Edgar's sister, has married Heathcliff, who is our main boy. And they got married. They are now living at Wuthering Heights, and she doesn't feel welcome. Of course she doesn't. He's a terrible person. Everybody else is like super cold and also kind of terrible. And so she writes to her brother just to say that they got married, also knowing that he's not gonna do anything to help her or to see her, because he said that he gave her like the line of, you either be with me or you be with Heathcliff, and she's like, bye, I'm gonna go hang out with Heathcliff. And so now she also wrote to Ellen, who we are hearing this story from. And Ellen goes and sees everything that's happening, and Heathcliff has a chat with her privately to say, you need to get me in to see Catherine. And Ellen's like, I can't do that. And so he's like, well, I'm not letting you leave until you let me do this. He's like, I either go there without your help and I hurt everybody that gets in my way, or you could just make it easy for me and tell me when nobody's going to be around, and then I can go see Catherine and have a secret meeting. So she does end up helping Heathcliff. He goes there to see Catherine. Catherine is not doing well. She is not really eating. She's not really drinking. She's just like a whisper. Loved you more intensely than Edgar will ever love you. Blah blah blah. It's all extremely. Oh yeah, she's not doing great. She's not doing wonderful. Edgar does come back home, and Heathcliff is like rushed away because drama, whatever. And Ellen is like, you have to leave. I will promise to tell you what happens to Catherine. Blah blah blah. And I think that might be where we left off. I think. Of course, if something comes up, I will pause and be like, oh yeah, by the way, this happened. But let's do it. Okay. Chapter 16. About 12 o'clock that night was born the Catherine you saw at Wuthering Heights, a puny 7 months child. And 2 hours after the mother died, having never recovered sufficient consciousness to miss Heathcliff or know Edgar, the latter's distraction at his bereavement is a subject too painful to be dwelt on. Its after effects showed how deep the sorrow sunk. A great addition, in my eyes, was his being left without an heir. I bemoaned that, as I gazed on the feeble orphan, and I mentally abused old Linton for what was only natural partiality, the securing his estate to his own daughter instead of his son's. An unwelcomed infant it was. Poor thing. It might have wailed out of life, and nobody cared a morsel during those first hours of existence. We redeemed the neglect afterwards, but its beginning was as friendless as its end is likely to be. Next morning, bright and cheerful, out of doors, stole softened in through the blinds of the silent room, and suffused the couch and its occupant with a mellow, tender glow. Edgar Linton had his head laid on the pillow and his eyes shut. His young and fair features were almost as deathlike as those of the form beside him, and almost as fixed. But his was the hush of exhausted anguish, and hers of perfect peace. Her brow smooth, her lids closed, her lips wearing the expression of a smile. No angel in heaven could be more beautiful than she appeared. And I partook of the infinite calm in which she lay. My mind was never in a holier frame than while I gazed on that untroubled image of divine rest. I instinctively echoed the words she had uttered a few hours before. Incomparably beyond and above us all, whether still on earth or now in heaven, her spirit is at home with God. I don't know if it be a peculiarity in me, but I am seldom otherwise than happy while watching in the chamber of death, should no frenzied or despairing mourner share the duty with me. I see a repose that neither earth nor hell can break, and I feel an assurance of the endless and shadowless hereafter, the eternity they have entered, where life is boundless in its duration, and love in its sympathy, and joy in its fullness. I noticed on that occasion how much selfishness there is even in a love like Mr. Linton's, when he so regretted Catherine's blessed release. To be sure, one might have doubted, after the wayward and impatient existence she had led, whether she merited a haven of peace at last. One might doubt in season of cold reflection, but not then, in the presence of her corpse. It asserted its own tranquillity, which seemed a pledge of equal quiet to its former inhabitant. Do you believe such people are happy in the other world, sir? I'd give a great deal to know. I declined answering Mrs. Dean's question, which struck me as something heterodox, which is not in accordance with correct or established principles. She proceeded. Retracting the course of Catherine Linton, I fear we have no right to think she is, but we'll leave her with her Maker. The master looked asleep, and I ventured soon after sunrise to quit the room and steal out to the pure, refreshing air. The servants thought me gone to shake off the drowsiness of my protracted watch. In reality, my chief motive was seeing Mr. Heathcliff. If he had remained among the larches all night, he would have heard nothing of the stir at the Grange, unless, perhaps, he might catch the gallop of the messenger going to Gimmerton. If he had come nearer, he would probably be aware, from the lights flitting to and fro, and the opening and shutting of the outer doors, that all was not right within. I wished, yet feared, to find him. I felt the terrible news must be told, and I longed to get over it. But how to do it I did not know. He was there, at least, a few yards further in the park, leant against an old ash tree, his hat off, and his hair soaked with the dew that had gathered on the budded branches, and fell patterning round him. He had been standing a long time in that position, for I saw a pair of osels, blackbirds, passing and repassing scarcely 3 feet from him, busy in building their nest, and regarding his proximity no more than that of a piece of timber. They flew off at my approach, and he raised his eyes and spoke. "She's dead," he said. "I have not waited for you to learn that. Put your handkerchief away. Don't sniffle before me. Damn you all, she wants none of your tears." I was weeping so much for him as her. We do sometimes pity creatures that have none of the feeling either for themselves or others. When I first looked into his face, I perceived that he had got intelligence of the catastrophe, and a foolish notion struck me that his heart was quelled, and he prayed, because his lips moved, and his gaze was bent on the ground. "Yes, she's dead," I answered, checking my sobs and drying my cheeks. "Gone to heaven, I hope, where we may, every one, join her, if we take due warning and leave our evil ways to follow good." "Did she take due warning, then?" asked Heathcliff, attempting a sneer. "Did she die like a saint? Come, give me a true history of the event. How did—" He endeavored to pronounce the name, but could not manage it, and compressing his mouth he held a silent combat with his inward agony, defying, meanwhile, my sympathy with an unflinching, ferocious state. "How did she die?" he resumed at last, fain, notwithstanding his hardihood, to have a support behind him, for, after the struggle, he trembled, in spite of himself, to his very finger-ends. "Poor wretch," I thought, "you have a heart and nerves the same as your brother men. Why should you be anxious to conceal them? Your pride cannot blind God. You tempt him to wring them till he forces a cry of humiliation." "Quietly as a lamb," I answered aloud. She drew a sigh and stretched herself, like a child reviving and sinking again to sleep. And 5 minutes after I felt one little pulse at her heart, and nothing more. And Did she ever mention me? He asked, hesitating, as if he dreaded the answer to his question would introduce details that he could not bear to hear. Her senses never returned. She recognized nobody from the time you left her, I said. She lies in a sweet smile on her face, and her latest ideas wandered back to pleasant early days. Her life closed in a gentle dream. May she wake as kindly in the other world. May she wake in torment, he cried, with frightful vehemence, stamping his foot, and groaning in a sudden paroxysm of ungovernable passion. Why, she's a liar to the end. Where is she? Not there, not in heaven, not perished. Where? Oh, you said you cared nothing for my sufferings, and I pray one prayer. I repeat it till my tongue stiffens. Catherine Earnshaw, may you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you. Haunt me, then. The murdered do haunt their murderers, I believe. I know that ghosts have wandered on earth. Be with me always. Take any form. Drive me mad. Only do not leave me in this abyss where I cannot find you. God, it is unutterable. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul. He dashed his head against the knotted trunk and, lifting up his eyes, howled, not like a man, but like a savage beast being goaded to death with knives and spears. I observed several splashes of blood about the bark of the tree, and his hand and forehead were both stained. Probably the scene I witnessed was a repetition of others acted during the night. I hardly moved my compassion. It appalled me. Still, I felt reluctant to quit him so. But the moment he recollected himself enough to notice me watching, he thundered a command for me to go, and I obeyed. He was beyond my skill to quiet or console. Mrs. Linton's funeral was appointed to take place on the Friday following her decease. Until then her coffin remained uncovered and strewn with flowers and scented leaves in the great drawing-room. Linton spent his days and nights there, a sleepless guardian and a circumstance concealed from all but me. Heathcliff spent his nights, at least, outside, equally a stranger to repose. I held no communication with him. Still, I was conscious of his design to enter, if he could, and on the Tuesday, a little after dark, when my master, from sheer fatigue, had been compelled to retire a couple hours early, I went and opened one of the windows, moved by his perseverance to give him a chance of bestowing on the faded image of his idol one final adieu. He did not omit to avail himself of the opportunity cautiously and briefly, too cautiously to betray his presence by the slightest noise. Indeed, I shouldn't have discovered that he had been there, except for the disarrangement of the drapery about the corpse's face, and for observing on the floor a curl of light hair, fastened with a silver thread, which, on examination, I ascertained to have been taken from a locket hung round Catherine's neck. Heathcliff had opened the trinket and cast out its contents, replacing them by a black lock of his own. I twisted the two and enclosed them together. Mr. Earnshaw was, of course, invited to attend the remains of his sister to the grave. He sent no excuse, but he never came, so that, besides her husband, the mourners were wholly composed of tenants and servants. Isabella was not asked. The place of Catherine's interment, to the surprise of the villagers, was neither in the chapel under the carved monument of the Lintons, nor yet by the tombs of her own relations outside. It was dug on a green slope in a corner of the kirkyard, where the wall is so low that heath and bilberry plants have climbed over it from the moor, and the peat mould almost buries it. Her husband lies in the same spot now, and they have each a simple headstone above, and a plain grey block at their feet to mark the graves. End of chapter 16. All right, so Catherine died. Catherine died, and Ellen had to go tell Heathcliff the news. And Heathcliff, of course, is upset. Of course. And is just like yelling out in anger, like punching the tree until he's like bloody, like on both his forehead and his knuckles. And is just like crying out, like, if you died, you said that you wouldn't leave this world, that it was me who killed you, that sort of thing. Well, people who die haunt their killers, haunt me so I'm not alone, that sort of thing. It's all very sad. Very sad and very tragic. And so her brother was invited to the funeral. He didn't show up and didn't make an excuse as to why Isabella was not invited. And the only people who attended her funeral besides Edgar were the people who worked in the house. Which is, that's sad. That's a little sad. Wouldn't be a gothic story without drama and sadness. Chapter 17. That Friday made the last of our fine days for a month. In the evening the weather broke. The wind shifted from south to northeast, and brought rain first, and then sleet and snow. On the morrow one could hardly imagine that there had been 3 weeks of summer. The primroses and crocuses were hidden under wintry drifts, the larks were silent, the young leaves of the early trees smitten and blackened, and dreary and chill and dismal that morrow did creep over. My master kept his room. I took possession of the lonely parlour, converting it into a nursery, and there I was, sitting with the moaning doll of a child laid at my knee, rocking it to and fro, and watching. Meanwhile, the still driving flakes build up the uncurtained window, when the door opened, and some person entered, out of breath and laughing. My anger was greater than my astonishment for a minute. I supposed it was one of the maids, and I cried, "Have done! How dare you show your giddiness here? What would Mr. Linton say if he heard you?" "Excuse me," answered a familiar voice, "but I know Edgar is in bed, and I cannot stop myself." With that, the speaker came forward to the fire, panting and holding her hand to her side. "I have run the whole way from Wuthering Heights," she continued, after a pause. "Except where I've flown. I couldn't count the number of falls I've had. Oh, I'm aching all over. Don't be alarmed. There shall be an explanation as soon as I can give it. Only just have the goodness to step out, and order the carriage to take me on to Gimmerton, and tell the servant to seek up a few clothes in my wardrobe." The intruder was Mrs. Heathcliff. She certainly seemed in no laughing predicament. Her hair streamed on her shoulders, dripping with snow and water. She was dressed in the girlish dress she commonly wore, befitting her age more than her position, a low frock with short sleeves, and nothing on either head or neck. The frock was of light silk, and clung to her with wet, and her feet were protected merely by thin slippers. Add to this a deep cut under one ear, which only the cold prevented from bleeding profusely, a white face scratched and bruised, and a frame hardly able to support itself through fatigue. And so you may fancy my first fright was not much allayed when I had had leisure to examine her. "My dear young lady," I exclaimed, "I'll stir nowhere and hear nothing till you have removed every article of your clothes and put on dry things, and certainly you shall not go to Gimmerton tonight, so it is needless to order the carriage." "Certainly I shall," she said, "walking or riding, yet I've no objection to dress myself decently. And I see how it flows down my neck now. The fire does make it smart." She insisted on my fulfilling her directions before she would let me touch her, and not till after the coachman had been instructed to get ready, and a maid set to pack up some necessary attire, did I obtain her consent for binding the wound and helping to change her garments. "Now, Ellen," she said, when my task was finished, and she was seated in an easy-chair on the hearth, with a cup of tea before her, "you sit down opposite me, and put poor Catherine's baby away. I don't want to see it. You mustn't think I cared little for Catherine, because I behaved so foolishly on entering. I've cried, too, bitterly, yes, more than anyone else has reason to cry. We parted unreconciled, you remember, and I shan't forgive myself. But, for all that, I was not going to sympathize with him, the brute beast. Oh, give me the poker. This is the last thing of his I have about me." She slipped the gold ring from her third finger and threw it on the floor. "I'll smash it," she continued, striking it with childish spite, "and then I'll burn it." And she took and dropped the misused article among the coals. "There, he shall buy another if he gets me back again. He'd be capable of coming to seek me to tease Edgar." I dare not stay, lest that notion should possess his wicked head, and besides, Edgar has not been kind, has he? And I won't come suing for his assistance, nor will I bring him into more trouble. Necessity compelled me to seek shelter here, though if I had not learned he was out of the way, I'd have halted at the kitchen, washed my face, warmed myself, got you to bring what I wanted, and departed again to anywhere out of reach of my accursed, of that incarnate goblin. Ah, he is in such a fury. If he had caught me, it's a pity Earnshaw is not his match in strength. I wouldn't have run till I'd seen him all but demolished, had Hindley been able to do it." "Well, don't talk so fast, miss," I interrupted. "You'll disorder the handkerchief I have tied round your face, and make the cut bleed again. Drink your tea, and take breath, and give over laughing. Laughter is sadly out of place under this roof, and in your condition." "An undeniable truth," she replied. "Listen to that child. It maintains a constant wail. Send it out of my hearing for an hour. I shan't stay any longer." I rang the bell, and committed it to a servant's care, and then I inquired what had urged her to escape from Wuthering Heights in such an unlikely plight, and where she meant to go, as she refused remaining with us. "I ought, and I wished to remain," answered she, "to cheer Edgar, and take care of the baby, for two things, and because the Grange is my right home. But I tell you, he wouldn't let me. Do you think he could bear to see me grow fat and merry, could bear to think that we were tranquil, and not resolve on poisoning our comfort? Now I have the satisfaction of being sure that he detests me, to the point of its annoying him seriously to have me within earshot or eyesight. I notice when I enter his presence, the muscles of his countenance are involuntarily distorted into an expression of hatred. Partly arising from his knowledge of the good cause I have to feel that sentiment for him, and partly from original aversion. It is strong enough to make me feel pretty certain that he could not chase me over England, supposing I contrived a clear escape, and therefore I must get quite away. I've recovered from my first desire to be killed by him. I'd rather he kill himself. He has extinguished my love effectually, and so I'm at my ease. I can recollect yet how I loved him, and can dimly imagine that I could still be loving him, if— No, even if he had doted on me, the devilish nature would have revealed its existence somehow. Catherine had an awfully perverted taste to esteem him so dearly, knowing him so well. Monster, would that he could be blotted out of creation, and out of my memory." "Hush, hush! He's a human being," I said. "Be more charitable. There are worse men than he is yet." "He's not a human being," she retorted, "and he has no claim on my charity. I gave him my heart, and he took and pinched it to death, and flung it back to me. People feel with their hearts, Ellen, and since he has destroyed mine, I have no power to feel for him, and I would not, though he groaned from this to his dying day, and wept tears of blood for Catherine. No, indeed, I wouldn't." And here Isabella began to cry, but immediately dashing the water from her lashes, she recommenced. You asked what has driven me to flight at last? I was compelled to attempt it, because I had succeeded in rousing his rage a pitch above his malignity. Pulling out the nerves with red-hot pincers requires more coolness than knocking on the head. He was worked up to forget the fiendish prudence he boasted of, and proceeded to murderous violence. I experienced pleasure in being able to exasperate him. The sense of pleasure in woke my instinct of self-preservation, so I fairly broke free, and if ever I come into his hands again, he is welcome to a signal revenge. Yesterday, you know, Mr Earnshaw should have been at the funeral. He kept himself sober for the purpose, tolerably sober, not going to bed mad at 6 o'clock and getting up drunk at 12. Consequently, he rose in suicidal low spirits, as fit for the church as for the dance, and instead he sat down by the fire and swallowed gin or brandy by tumblerfuls. Heathcliff, I shudder to name him, has been a stranger in the house from last Sunday till today. Whether the angels have fed him or his kin beneath, I cannot tell. But he has not eaten a meal with us for nearly a week. He has just come home at dawn and gone upstairs to his chamber, locking himself in, as if anybody dreamt of coveting his company. There he has continued, praying like a Methodist, only the deity he implored is senseless dust and ashes, and God, when addressed, was curiously confounded with his own black father. After concluding these precious orisons, and they lasted generally till he grew hoarse, and his voice was strangled in his throat, he would be off again, always straight down to the Grange. I wonder Edgar did not send for a constable and give him into custody. For me, grieved as I was about Catherine, it was impossible to avoid regarding this season of deliverance from degrading oppression as a holiday. I recovered spirits sufficient to hear Joseph's eternal lectures about weeping, and to move up and down the house less with the foot of a frightened thief than formerly. You wouldn't think that I should cry at anything Joseph could say, but he and Hareton are detestable companions. I'd rather sit with Hindley and hear his awful talk than with that to little Maester as his staunch supporter, that odious old man. When Heathcliff is in, I'm often obliged to seek the kitchen and their society, or starve among the damp, uninhibited chambers. When he is not, as was the case this week, I establish a table and chair at one corner of the house fire, and never mind how Mr Earnshaw may occupy himself, and he does not interfere with my arrangements. He is quieter now than he used to be, if no one provokes him, more sullen and depressed, and less furious. Joseph affirms he's sure he's an altered man, that the Lord has touched his heart, and he is saved, so as by fire. I'm puzzled to detect signs of a favourable change, but it is not my business. Yester evening I sat in my nook reading some old books till late on towards 12. It seemed so dismal to go upstairs, with the wild snow blowing outside, and my thoughts continually reverting to the kirkyard and the new-made grave. I dared hardly lift my eyes from the page before me, that melancholy scene so instantly usurped its place. Hindley sat opposite, his head leaned on his hand, perhaps meditating on the same subject. He had ceased drinking at a point below irrationality, and had neither stirred nor spoken during 2 or 3 hours. There was no sound through the house but the moaning wind which shook the windows every now and then, the faint cracking of the coals, and the click of my snuffers as I removed at intervals the long wick of the candle. Hareton and Joseph were probably fast asleep in bed. It was very, very sad, and while I read I sighed, and for it seemed as if all joy had vanished from the world, never to be restored. The doleful silence was broken at length by the sound of the kitchen latch. Heathcliff had returned from his watch earlier than usual, owing, I suppose, to the sudden storm. That entrance was fastened, and we heard him coming round to get in by the other. I rose with an irrepressible expression of what I felt on my lips, which induced my companion, who had been staring towards the door, to turn and look at me. "I'll keep him out 5 minutes," he exclaimed. "You won't object?" "No, you may keep him out the whole night for me," I answered. "Do put the key in the lock and draw the bolts." Earnshaw accomplished this ere his guest reached the front. He then came and brought his chair to the other side of my table, leaning over it and searching in my eyes for a sympathy with the burning hate that gleamed from his. As he both looked and felt like an assassin, he couldn't exactly find that, but he discovered enough to encourage him to speak. "You and I," he said, "have each a great debt to settle with the man out yonder. If we were neither of us cowards, we might combine to discharge it. Are you as soft as your brother? Are you willing to endure to the last, and not once attempt a repayment?" "I'm weary of enduring now," I had replied, "and I'd be glad of a retaliation that wouldn't recoil on myself, but treachery and violence are spears pointed at both ends. They wound those who resort to them worse than to their enemies." "Treachery and violence are a just return for treachery and violence," cried Hindley. "Mrs. Heathcliff, I'll ask you to do nothing but sit still and be dumb. Tell me now, can you? I'm sure you would have as much pleasure as I in witnessing the conclusion of the fiend's existence. He'll be your death unless you overreach him, and he'll be my ruin. Damn the hellish villain. He knocks at the door as if he were master here already. Promise to hold your tongue, and before that clock strikes, it wants 3 minutes of 1. You're a free woman." He took the implements which I described to you in my letter from his breast, and would have turned down the candle. I snatched it away, however, and seized his arm. "I'll not hold my tongue," I said. "You mustn't touch him. Let the door remain shut, and be quiet." "No. I've formed my resolution, and by God I'll execute it," cried the desperate being. "I'll do you a kindness in spite of yourself, inheriting justice. And you needn't trouble your head to screen me. Catherine is gone. Nobody alive would regret me or be ashamed, though I cut my throat this minute, and it's time to make an end." I might as well have struggled with a bear or reasoned with a lunatic. The only resource left me was to run to a lattice and warn his intended victim of the fate which awaited him. "You'd better seek shelter somewhere else tonight," I exclaimed, in rather a triumphant tone. "Mr. Earnshaw has a mind to shoot you if you persist in endeavoring to enter." "You'd better open the door, you," he answered, addressing me by some elegant term that I don't care to repeat. "I shall not meddle in the matter," I retorted again. "Come in and get shot, if you please. I've done my duty." With that I shut the door. I shut the window and returned to my place by the fire, having too small a stock of hypocrisy at my command to pretend any anxiety for the danger that menaced him. Earnshaw swore passionately at me, affirming that I loved the villain yet, and calling me all sorts of names for the base spirit I evinced, and I, in my secret heart and conscience never reproached me, thought what a blessing it would be for him should Heathcliff put him out of misery, and what a blessing for me should he send Heathcliff to his night abode. As I sat nursing these reflections, the casement behind me was banged on to the floor by a blow from the latter individual, and his countenance looked blightingly through. The stanchions stood too close to suffer, his shoulders to follow, and I smiled, exulting in my fancied security. His hair and clothes were whitened with snow, and his sharp cannibal teeth, revealed by cold and wrath, gleamed through the dark. "Isabella, let me in, or I'll make you repent." He grinned, as Joseph Carl did. Or gurned, excuse me, not grinned. He gurned, which means like snarled. "I cannot commit murder," I replied. "Mr. Hindley stands sentinel with a knife and loaded pistol." "Let me in by the kitchen door," he said. "Hindley will be there before me," I answered. "And there's a poor love of yours that cannot bear a shower of snow. We were left at peace in our beds as long as the summer moon shone, but the moment a blast of winter returns, you must run for shelter. Heathcliff, if I were you, I'd go stretch myself over my grave and die like a faithful dog. The world is surely not worth living in now, is it? You had distinctly impressed on me the idea that Catherine was the whole joy of your life. I can't imagine how you think of surviving her loss." "He's there, is he?" exclaimed my companion, rushing to the gap. "If I can get my arm out, I can hit him." "I'm afraid, Ellen, you'll set me down as really wicked, but you don't know all, so don't judge. I wouldn't have aided or abetted an attempt on even his life for anything. Wish that he were dead I must, and therefore I was fearfully disappointed and unnerved by terror for the consequences of my taunting speech, when he flung himself on Earnshaw's weapon and wrenched it from his grasp. The charge exploded, and the knife, in springing back, closed into its owner's wrist. Heathcliff pulled it away by main force, slitting up the flesh as it passed on, and thrust it dripping into his pocket. He then took a stone, struck down the division between two windows, and sprang in. His adversary had fallen senseless with excessive pain and the flow of blood that gushed from an artery or a large vein. The ruffian kicked and trampled on him, and dashed his head repeatedly against the flags, holding me with one hand, meantime, to prevent me summoning Joseph. He exerted preterhuman self-denial in abstaining from finishing him completely, but getting out of breath, he finally desisted, and dragged the apparently inanimate body onto the settle. There he tore off the sleeve of Earnshaw's coat, and bound up the wound with brutal roughness, spitting and cursing during the operation as energetically as he had kicked before. Being at liberty, I lost no time in seeking the old servant, who, having gathered by degrees the purport of my hasty tale, hurried below, gasping, as he descended the steps two at once. "What is there to do now? What is there to do now?" "There's this to do," thundered Heathcliff, "that your master's mad, and should he last another month, I'll have him to an asylum. And how the devil did you come to fasten me out, you toothless hound? Don't stand muttering and mumbling there. Come, I'm not going to nurse him. Wash that stuff away, and mind the sparks of your candle. It is more than half brandy." "And so you've been mothering on him?" "Murdering," exclaimed Joseph, lifting his hands and eyes in horror. "If ever I seed a sight like this, may the Lord—" Heathcliff gave him a push to his knees in the middle of the blood, and flung a towel to him, but instead of proceeding to dry it up, he joined his hands and began a prayer, which excited my laughter from its odd phraseology. I was in the condition of mind to be shocked at nothing. In fact, I was as reckless as some malefactors show themselves at the foot of the gallows. "Oh, I forgot you," said the tyrant. "You shall do that. Down with you. And you conspire with him against me, do you, viper? There, that is work fit for you." He shook me till my teeth rattled, and pinched me beside Joseph, who steadily concluded his supplications, and then rose, vowing he would set off for the Grange directly. Mr. Linton was a magistrate, and though he had 50 wives dead, he should inquire into this. He was so obstinate in his resolution that Heathcliff deemed it expedient to compel from my lips a recapitulation of what had taken place, standing over me, heaving with malevolence as I reluctantly delivered this account in answer to his questions. It required a great deal of labor to satisfy the old man that Heathcliff was not the aggressor, especially with my hardly wrung replies. However, Mr. Earnshaw soon convinced him he was alive still. Joseph hastened to administer a dose of spirits, and by the succour his master presently regained motion and consciousness. Heathcliff, aware that his opponent was ignorant of the treatment received while insensible, called him deliriously intoxicated, and said he should not notice his atrocious conduct further. But judicious counsel, and Hindley stretched himself on the hearthstone. I departed to my own room, marvelling that I had escaped so easily. This morning, when I came down about half an hour before noon, Mr. Earnshaw was sitting in the fire, deadly sick, his evil genius almost as gaunt and ghastly, leant against the chimney. Neither appeared inclined to dine, and having waited till all was cold on the table, I commenced alone. Nothing hindered me from eating heartily, and I experienced a certain sense of satisfaction and superiority as, at intervals, I cast a look towards my silent companions, and felt the comfort of a quiet conscience within me. After I had done, I ventured on the usual liberty of drawing near the fire, going round Earnshaw's seat, and kneeling in the corner beside him. Heathcliff did not glance my way, and I gazed up and contemplated his features almost as confidently as if they had been turned to stone. His forehead, that I once thought so manly, and that I now think so diabolical, was shaded with a heavy cloud. His basilisk eyes were nearly quenched by sleeplessness and weeping, perhaps, for the lashes were wet then. His lips devoid of their ferocious sneer, and sealed in an expression of unspeakable sadness. Had it been another, I would have covered my face in the presence of such grief. In his case, I was gratified, and, ignoble as it seems to insult a fallen enemy, I couldn't miss this chance of sticking in a dart. His weakness was the only time when I could taste the delight of paying wrong for wrong. Fie, miss, I interrupted. One might suppose you had never opened a Bible in your life. If God afflict your enemies, surely that ought to suffice you. It is both mean and presumptuous to add your torture to his. In general, I'll allow it would be, Ellen, she continued. But what misery laid on Heathcliff could content me, unless I have a hand in it. I'd rather be suffered less if I might cause his suffering, and he might know that I was the cause. Oh, I owe him so much. On only one condition can I hope to forgive him. It is, if I may take an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. For every wretch of agony return a wrench. Reduce him to my level. As he was the first to injure, make him the first to implore pardon, and then, why then, Ellen, I might show you some generosity. But it is purely impossible I can ever be revenged, and therefore I cannot forgive him. Hindley wanted some water, and I handed him a glass, and asked him how he was. Not as ill as I wish, he replied. But leaving out my arm, every inch of me is as sore as if I had been fighting with a legion of imps. Yes, no wonder, was my next remark. Catherine used to boast that she stood between you and bodily harm. She meant that certain persons would not hurt you for fear of offending her. It's well people don't really rise from their grave, or, last night, she might have witnessed a repulsive scene. Are not you bruised and cut over your chest and shoulders? I can't say, he answered. But what do you mean? Did he dare to strike me when I was down? He trampled on and kicked you, and dashed you on the ground, I whispered, and his mouth watered to tear you with his teeth, because he's only half man, not so much, and the rest fiend. Mr. Earnshaw looked up, like me, to the countenance of our mutual foe, who, absorbed in his anguish, seemed insensible to anything around him. The longer he stood, the plainer his reflections revealed their blackness through his features. Oh, if God would but give me strength to strangle him in my last agony, I'd go to hell with joy, groaned the impatient man, writhing to rise and sinking back in despair, convinced of his inadequacy for the struggle. Nay, it's not that he has murdered one of you, I observed aloud. It's at the Grange. Everyone knows your sister would have been living now had it not been for Mr. Heathcliff. After all, it is preferable to be hated than loved by him. When I recollect how happy we were, how happy Catherine was before he came, I'm fit to curse the day. Most likely Heathcliff noticed more the truth of what was said than the spirit of the person who said it. His attention was roused, I saw, for his eyes rained down tears among the ashes, and he drew his breath in suffocating sighs. I stared full at him and laughed scornfully. The clouded windows of hell flashed a moment towards me. The fiend, which usually looked out, however, was so dimmed and drowned that I did not fear to hazard another sound of derision. "Get up, and be gone out of my sight," said the mourner. I guess he uttered those words, at least, though his voice was hardly intelligible. "I beg your pardon," I replied, "but I loved Catherine too, and her brother requires attendance, which, for her sake, I shall supply. Now that she's dead, I see her in Hindley. Hindley has exactly her eyes. If you had not tried to gouge them out, and make them black and red, and her— Get up, wretched idiot, before I stamp you to death," he cried, making a movement that caused me to make one also. "But then," I continued, holding myself ready to flee, "if poor Catherine had trusted you, and resumed the ridiculous, contemptible, degrading title of Mrs. Heathcliff, she would soon have presented a similar picture. She wouldn't have borne your abominable behaviour quietly. Her detestation and disgust must have found voice. The back of the settle and Earnshaw's person imposed between me and him, so instead of endeavouring to reach me, he snatched a dinner knife from the table and flung it at my head. It struck beneath my ear and stopped the sentence I was uttering, but, pulling it out, I sprang at the door and delivered another, which I hope went a little deeper than his missile. The last glimpse I caught of him was a furious rush on his part, checked by the embrace of his host, and both fell locked together on the hearth. In my flight through the kitchen, I bid Joseph speed to his master. I knocked over Hareton, who was hanging a litter of puppies from a chair back in the doorway, and, blessed as a soul escaped from purgatory, I bounded, leaped, and flew down the steep road. Then, quitting its windings, shot direct across the moor, rolling over banks and wading through marshes, precipitating myself, in fact, towards the beacon light of the Grange. And far rather would I be condemned to a perpetual dwelling in the infernal regions than, even for one night, abide beneath the roof of Wuthering Heights again. Isabella ceased speaking, and took a drink of tea. Then she rose, and, bidding me put on her bonnet and a great shawl I had brought, and turning a deaf ear to my entreaties for her to remain another hour, she stepped on to a chair, kissed Edgar's and Catherine's portraits, bestowed a similar salute on me, and descended to the carriage, accompanied by Fanny, who yelped wild with joy at recovering her mistress. She was driven away, never to revisit this neighbourhood, but a regular correspondence was established between her and my master when things were more settled. I believe her new abode was in the south, near London. There she had a son born a few months subsequent to her escape. He was christened Linton, and, from the first, she reported him to be ailing, peevish creature. Mr. Heathcliff, meeting me one day in the village, inquired where she lived. I refused to tell. He remarked that it was not of any moment, only she must beware of coming to her brother. She should not be with him, if he had to keep her himself, though I would give no information, he discovered, through some of the other servants, both her place of residence and the existence of the child. Still, he didn't bother her, for which forbearance she might thank his aversion, I suppose. He often asked about the infant when he saw me, and on hearing its name, smiled grimly and observed, "They wish me to hate it too, do they?" "I don't think they wish you to know anything about it," I answered. "But I'll have it," he said, "when I want it. They may reckon on that." Fortunately, its mother died before the time arrived, some 13 years after the decease of Catherine, when Linton was 12, or a little more. On the day succeeding Isabella's unexpected visit, I had no opportunity of speaking to my master. He shunned conversation and was fit for discussing nothing. When I could get him to listen, I saw it pleased him that his sister had left her husband, whom he had abhorred from an intensity which the mildness of his nature would scarcely seem to allow. So deep and sensitive was his aversion that he refrained from going anywhere where he was likely to see or hear of Heathcliff. Grief and that together transformed him into a complete hermit. He threw up his office of magistrate, ceased even to attend church, avoided the village on all accounts, and spent a life of entire seclusion within the limits of its park and grounds, only varied by solitary rambles on the moors and visits to the grave of his wife, mostly at evening or early morning, before other wanderers were abroad. But he was too good to be thoroughly unhappy long. He didn't pray for Catherine's soul to haunt him. Time brought resignation and a melancholy sweeter than common joy. He recalled her memory with ardent, tender love, and hoping and hopeful aspiring to the better world where he doubted not she was gone. And he had earthly consolation and affections too. For a few days, I said, he seemed regardless of the puny successor of the departed. That coldness melted as fast as snow in April, and ere the tiny thing could stammer a word or totter a step, it wielded a despot's scepter in his heart. It was named Catherine, but he never called it the name in full, as he had never called the first Catherine short, probably because Heathcliff had a habit of doing so. The little one was always Cathy. It formed to him a distinction from the mother, and yet a connection with her, and his attachment sprang from its relation to her, far more than from its being his own. I used to draw a comparison between him and Hindley Earnshaw, and perplex myself to explain satisfactorily why their conduct was so opposite in similar circumstances. They had both been fond husbands, and were both attached to their children, and I could not see how they shouldn't both have taken the same road, for good or evil. But, I thought in my mind, Hindley, with apparently the stronger head, has shown himself sadly the worse and the weaker man. When his ship struck, the captain abandoned his post, and the crew, instead of trying to save her, rushed into riot and confusion, leaving no hope for their luckless vessel. Linton, on the contrary, displayed the true courage of a loyal and faithful soul. He trusted God, and God comforted him. One hoped, and the other despaired. They chose their own lots, and were righteously doomed to endure them. But you'll not want to hear my moralizing, Mr. Lockwood. You'll judge as well as I can all these things. At least you'll think you will, and that's the same. The end of Earnshaw was what might have been expected. It followed fast on his sister's. There were scarcely 6 months between them. We, at the Grange, never got a very succinct account of his state preceding it. All that I did learn was on occasion of going to aid in the preparations for the funeral. Mr. Kenneth came to announce the event to my master. "Well, Nelly," said he, riding into the yard one morning, too early not to alarm me with an instant presentiment of bad news, "it's yours and my turn to go into mourning at present. Who's given us the slip now, do you think?" "Who?" I asked in a flurry. "Why, guess," he returned, dismounting and slinging his bridle on the hook of the door. "And nip up the corner of your apron. I'm certain you'll need it." "Not Mr. Heathcliff, surely!" I exclaimed. "What? Would you have tears for him?" said the doctor. "No, Heathcliff's a tough young fellow. He looks blooming today. I've just seen him. He's rapidly regaining flesh since he lost his better half." "Who is it, then, Mr. Kenneth?" I repeated impatiently. "Hindley Earnshaw, your old friend Hindley," he replied. "And my wicked gossip, though he's been too wild for me this long while. There, I said we should draw water. But cheer up. He died true to his character, drunk as a lord. Poor lad. I'm sorry, too. One can't help missing an old companion, though he had the worst tricks with them that ever man imagined, and has done me many a rascally turn. He's barely 27, it seems. That's your own age. Who would have thought you were born in 1 year?" I confess this blow as greater to me than the shock of Mrs. Linton's death. Ancient associations lingered round my heart. I sat down in the porch and wept as for a blood relation, desiring Mr. Kenneth to get another servant to introduce him to the master. I could not hinder myself from pondering on the question. Had he had fair play? Whatever I did, that idea would bother me. It was so tiresomely pertinacious that I resolved on requesting leave to go to Wuthering Heights and assist in the last duties to the dead. Mr. Linton was extremely reluctant to consent, but I pleaded eloquently for the friendless condition in which he lay, and I said my old master and foster brother had a claim on my services as strong as his own. Besides, I reminded him that the child Hareton was his wife's nephew, and, in the absence of nearer kin, he ought to act as its guardian, and he ought to and must inquire how the property was left, and look over the concerns of his brother-in-law. He was unfit for attending to such matters, but he bid me speak to his lawyer, and at length permitted me to go. His lawyer had been Earnshaw's also. I called at the village and asked him to accompany me. He shook his head and advised that Heathcliff should be let alone, affirming, if the truth were known, Hareton would be found little else than a beggar. His father died in debt, he said. The whole property is mortgaged, and the sole chance for the natural heir is to allow him an opportunity of creating some interest in the creditor's heart, that he may be inclined to deal leniently towards him. When I reached the Heights, I explained that I had come to see everything carried out decently, and Joseph, who appeared in sufficient distress, expressed satisfaction at my presence. Mr. Heathcliff said he did not perceive that I was wanted, but I might stay and order the arrangements for the funeral, if I chose. Correctly, he remarked. That fool's body should be buried at the crossroads without ceremony of any kind. I happened to leave him 10 minutes yesterday afternoon, and in that interval he fastened the 2 doors of the house against me, and he has spent the night in drinking himself to death deliberately. We broke in this morning, for we heard him snorting like a horse, and there he was, laid over the settle. Flaying and scalping would not have waked him. I sent for Kenneth, and he came, but not till the beast had changed into carrion. He was both dead and cold and stark, and you'll allow it was useless making more stir about him. The old servant confirmed this statement, but muttered, I'd rather he goen histlin for the doctor. I should ha'n't tent o' the maester better nor him, and he warn't deed when I left him, nor to the sort. There's a footnote. I'd rather be gone for the doctor himself. I should have taken care of the master better than him, and he wasn't dead when I left. Nothing of the sort. I insisted on the funeral being respectable. Mr. Heathcliff said I might have my own way there too, only he desired me to remember that the money for the whole affair came out of his pocket. He maintained a hard, careless deportment, indicative of neither joy nor sorrow. If anything, it expressed a flinty gratification at a piece of difficult work successfully executed. I observed once, indeed, something like exultation in his aspect. It was just when the people were bearing the coffin from the house. He had the hypocrisy to represent a mourner. And previously to following with Hareton, he lifted the unfortunate child on the table and muttered, with peculiar gusto, Now, my bonny lad, you are mine, and we'll see if one tree won't grow as crooked as another, with the same wind to twist it. The unsuspecting thing was pleased at the speech. He played with Heathcliff's whiskers and stroked his cheek, but I divined its meaning, and observed tartly, That boy must go back with me to Thrushcross Grange, sir. There is nothing in the world less yours than he is. Does Linton say so? He demanded. Of course. He has ordered me to take him, I replied. Well, said the scoundrel, we'll not argue the subject now, but I have a fancy to try my hand at rearing a young one. so intimate to your master that I must supply the place of this with my own, if he attempt to remove it. I don't engage to let Hareton go undisputed, but I'll be pretty sure to make the other come. Remember to tell him." The hint was enough to bind our hands. I repeated its substance on my return, and Edgar Linton, little interested at the commencement, spoke no more of interfering. I'm not aware that he could have done it to any purpose, had he been ever so willing. The guest was now the master of Wuthering Heights. He held firm possession, and proved to the attorney, who in his turn proved it to Mr. Linton, that Earnshaw had mortgaged every yard of land he owned for cash to supply his mania for gaming, and he, Heathcliff, was the mortgagee. In that manner Hareton, who should now be the first gentleman in the neighbourhood, was reduced to a state of complete dependence on his father's inveterate enemy, and lives in his own house as a servant, deprived of the advantage of wages, quite unable to right himself, because of his friendlessness and his ignorance that he has been wronged. End of chapter 17. Okay, so everybody's dying. Catherine died in the last one, as we know, but it starts with Isabella leaving, and so she comes into the Grange and explaining all of these things that have happened and just giving us a little peek into Wuthering Heights after Catherine's death. And it's not great. I mean, life there has never been great, but Heathcliff is disappearing for, like a week at a time where nobody really sees him because he leaves super early in the morning and he comes home super, super late, all of these things. But Hindley is drinking more and more, and he has decided that he's gonna seriously harm Heathcliff, and he's telling Isabella this and making Isabella like an accomplice of sorts, and she can't, with good conscience, just let Heathcliff walk into the room. So she bars the door, tells Heathcliff all of these things that are happening. Heathcliff gets all riled up, all of these things, blah blah blah. Um, Isabella is bleeding because she is like arguing back and forth, and then who is it? Was it, I don't remember if it was Heathcliff or if it was I think it was Hindley, threw the blade at her, and it like got her under the ear, and so she like threw one back at him and it got him. She's like, I hope it like hurt him worse than he hurt me. And so she fled and she left, and like since she has left, she has been able to make amends with her brother, and they have been writing back and forth with each other. She also died while she was gone, and I mean, this is like, I think we're just like wrapping up her story. Like this is like years in coming, and Ellen has been like out about in town, and Heathcliff has asked where the whereabouts of Isabella, and she's like, I'm not going to tell you, and I'm never going to tell you. And he just, wants to take care of the kid, which is Catherine's kid, and it's a no-go. Like, they're not going to let that happen. And Catherine's kid is named Kathy. Well, is named Catherine, but Edgar calls her Kathy because it just can't deal with calling the kid Catherine. Let's see what else has happened. Ellen goes to Wuthering Heights because Hindley has died. He has basically drank himself to death. And so she goes over there to like assist with the house and everything like that. Heathcliff wants to keep Hareton as his, I don't know, he just like wants to keep him. And there is like a bit of a legal battle, but because of the way the finances and because Hindley or Earnshaw died. I keep saying Hindley. I'm getting all of these names mixed up. apologies, Earnshaw died at the ripe old age of 27. And Hareton is Earnshaw's kid. Yes, okay. I'm just getting everybody mixed up. I'm sorry. um, but because of like legal things and whatever, Hareton is now living in Wuthering Heights still, but not as like the master of the house. He's there as like a servant who's not getting paid. So that's fun. And that's where we ended. Okay. Chapter 18. The 12 years, continued Mrs. Dean, following the dismal period, were the happiest of my life. My greatest troubles in their passage rose from our little lady's trifling illnesses, which she had to experience in common with all children, rich and poor. For the rest, after the first 6 months, she grew like a larch, a tree with tough, durable wood, and would walk and talk too, in her own way, before the heath blossomed a second time over Mrs. Linton's dust. She was the most winning thing that ever brought sunshine into a desolate house, a real beauty in face, with the Earnshaws' handsome dark eyes, but the Lintons' fair skin and small features and yellow curling hair. Her spirit was high, though not rough, and qualified by a heart sensitive and lively to excess in its affections. That capacity for intense attachments reminded me of her mother. Still, she did not resemble her, for she could be soft and mild as a dove, and she had a gentle voice and passive expression. Her anger was never furious, her love never fierce. It was deep and tender. However, it must be acknowledged she had faults to foil her gifts. A propensity to be saucy was one, and a perverse will that indulged children invariably acquire, whether they be good-tempered or cross. If a servant chanced to vex her, it was always, "I shall tell papa," and if he reproved her, even by a look, you would have thought it a heartbreaking business. I don't believe he ever did speak a harsh word to her. He took her education entirely on himself, and made it amusement. Fortunately, curiosity and a quick intellect made her an apt scholar. She learned rapidly and eagerly, and did honor to his teachings. Till she reached the age of 13, she had not once been beyond the range of a park by herself. Mr. Linton would take her with him a mile or so outside, on rare occasions, but he trusted her to no one else. Gimmerton was an unsubstantial name in her ears. The chapel, the only building she had approached or entered, except her own home. Wuthering Heights and Mr. Heathcliff did not exist for her. She was a perfect recluse, and apparently perfectly contented. Sometimes, indeed, while surveying the country from her nursery window, she would observe, "Ellen, how long will it be before I can walk to the top of those hills? I wonder what lies on the other side. Is it the sea?" "No, Miss Cathy," I would answer. "It is hills again, just like these." "And what are those golden rocks like when you stand under them?" she asked. The abrupt descent to Penistone Crags particularly attracted her notice, especially when the setting sun rose on it and the topmost heights, and the whole extent of landscape besides lay in shadow. I explained that they were bare masses of stone, with hardly enough earth in their clefts to nourish a stunted tree. "And why are they bright so long after it is evening here?" she pursued. "Because they are a great deal higher up than we are," replied I. "You could not climb them, they are too high and steep. In winter the frost is always there before it comes to us, and deep into summer I have found snow under that black hollow on the northeast side." "Oh, you have been on them!" she cried gleefully. "Then I can go too, when I am a woman. Has papa been, Ellen?" "Papa would tell you, miss," I answered hastily, "that they are not worth the trouble of visiting. The moors where you ramble with him are much nicer, and Thrushcross Park is the finest place in the world." "But I know the park, and I don't know those," she murmured to herself. "And I should delight to look round me from the brow of that tallest point. My little pony Minnie shall take me some time." One of the maids mentioning the fairy cave quite turned her head with a desire to fulfill this project. She teased Mr. Linton about it, and he promised she should have the journey when she got older. But Miss Catherine measured her age by months, and "Now am I old enough to go to Penistone Crag?" was the constant question in her mouth. The road thither wound close by Wuthering Heights. Edgar had not the heart to pass it, so she received as constantly the answer, "Not yet, my love, not yet." I said Mrs. Heathcliff lived above a dozen years after quitting her husband. Her family were a delicate constitution. She and Edgar both lacked the ruddy health that you will generally meet in these parts. What her last illness was, I'm not certain. I conjecture they died of the same thing, a kind of fever, slow at its commencement, but incurable, and rapidly consuming life towards the end. She wrote to inform her brother of the probable conclusion of a 4 months' indisposition under which she had suffered, and entreated him to come to her, if possible, for she had much to settle, and she wished to bid him adieu, and deliver Linton safely into his hands. Her hope was that Linton might be left with him, as he had been with her. His father, she would fain convince herself, had no desire to assume the burden of his maintenance or education. My master hesitated not a moment in complying with her request, reluctant as he was to leave home at ordinary calls. He flew to answer this, commending Catherine to my peculiar vigilance in his absence, with reiterated orders that she must not wander out of the park, even under my escort. He did not calculate on her going unaccompanied. He was away 3 weeks. The first day or two my charge sat in a corner of the library, too sad for either reading or playing. In that quiet state she caused me little trouble, but it was succeeded by an interval of impatient, fretful weariness, and being too busy and too old then to run up and down amusing her, I hit on a method by which she might entertain herself. I used to send her on her travels round the grounds, now on foot, and now on a pony, indulging her with a patient audience of all her real and imaginary adventures when she returned. The summer shone in full prime, and she took such a taste for his solitary rambling that she often contrived to remain out of breakfast till tea, and then the evenings were spent in recounting her fanciful tales. I did not fear her breaking bounds, because the gates were generally locked, and I thought she would scarcely venture forth alone, if they had stood wide open. Unluckily, my confidence proved misplaced. Catherine came to me, one morning, at 8 o'clock, and said she was that day an Arabian merchant, going to cross the desert with his caravan, and I must give her plenty of provision for herself and beasts, a horse and 3 camels, personated by a large hound and a couple of pointers. I got together a good store of dainties and slung them in a basket on one side of the saddle, and she sprang up as happy as a fairy, sheltered by her wide-brimmed hat and gauze veil from the July sun, and trotted off with a merry laugh, mocking my cautious counsel to avoid galloping and come back early. The naughty thing never made her appearance at tea. One traveller, the hound, being an old dog and fond of its ease, returned, but neither Cathy nor the pony nor the 2 pointers were visible in any direction. I dispatched emissaries down this path and that path, and at last went wandering in search. of her myself. There was a laborer working at a fence round a plantation on the borders of the grounds. I inquired of him if he had seen our young lady. "I saw her at morn," he replied. "She would have me to cut her a hazel switch, and then she leapt her galloway over the hedge yonder, where it is lowest, and galloped out of sight." You may guess how I felt at hearing the news. It struck me directly she must have started for Penistone Crags. "What will become of her?" I ejaculated, pushing through a gap which the man was repairing, and making straight to the high road. I walked as if for a wager, mile after mile, till a turn brought me in view of the heights, but no Catherine could I detect, far or near. The crags lie about a mile and a half beyond Mr Heathcliff's place, and that is 4 from the Grange, so I began to fear night would fall ere I could reach them. And what if she should have slipped in clambering among them, I reflected, and been killed, or broken some of her bones? My response was truly painful, and at first it gave me delightful relief to observe, in hurrying by the farmhouse, Charlie, the fiercest of the pointers, lying under a window, with swelled head and bleeding ear. I opened the wicket and ran to the door, knocking vehemently for admittance. A woman whom I knew, and who formerly lived at Gimmerton, answered. He had been servant there since the death of Mr Earnshaw. "Ah," she said, "you are come a-seeking your little mistress. Don't be frightened, she's here safe, but I'm glad it isn't the master." "He is not at home, then, is he?" I panted, quite breathless with quick walk and alarm. "No, no," she replied. "Both he and Joseph are off, and I think they won't return this hour or more. Step in and rest a bit." I entered, and beheld my stray lamb seated on the hearth, rocking herself in a little chair that had been her mother's when a child. Her hat was hung against the wall, and she seemed perfectly at home, laughing and chattering, in the best spirits imaginable. To Harrington, now a great, strong lad of 18, who stared at her with considerable curiosity and astonishment, comprehending precious little of the fluent succession of remarks and questions which her tongue never ceased pouring forth. "Very well, miss," I exclaimed, concealing my joy under an angry countenance. "This is your last ride till papa comes back. I'll not trust you over the threshold again, you naughty, naughty girl." "Ah, Ellen," she cried, gaily, jumping up and running to my side, "I shall have a pretty story to tell tonight. And so you found me out. Have you ever been here in your life before?" "Put that hat on and come home at once," said I. "I'm dreadfully grieved at you, Miss Cathy. You've done extremely wrong. It's no use pouting and crying, that won't repay the trouble I've had, scouring the country after you, to think how Mr Linton charged me to keep you in, and you stealing off so. It shows you are a cunning little fox, and nobody will put faith in you any more." "What have I done?" sobbed she, instantly checked. "Papa charged me nothing. He'll not scold me, Ellen. He's never cross like you. Come, come," I repeated. "I'll tie the riband. Now let us have no petulance. Oh, for shame! You 13 years old, and such a baby!" This exclamation was caused by her pushing the hat from her head, and retreating to the chimney out of my reach. "Nay," said the servant, "don't be hard on the bonny lass, Mrs Dean. We made her stop. She fain have ridden forwards, afeard you should be uneasy. Hareton offered to go with her, and I thought he should. It's a wild road over the hills." Hareton, during this discussion, stood with his hands in his pockets, too awkward to speak, though he looked as if he did not relish my intrusion. "How long am I to wait?" I continued, disregarding the woman's interference. "It will be dark in 10 minutes. Where is the pony, Miss Cathy? And where is Phoenix? I shall leave you unless you be quick, so please yourself." "The pony is in the yard," she replied, "and Phoenix is shut in there. He's bitten, and so is Charlie. I was going to tell you all about it, but you are in a bad temper and don't deserve to hear." I picked up her hat, and approached to reinstate it, but perceiving that the people of the house took her part, She commenced capering round the room, and on my giving chase, ran like a mouse over and under and behind the furniture, rendering it ridiculous for me to pursue. Hareton and the woman laughed, and she joined them, and waxed more impertinent still, till I cried, in such irritation, "Well, Miss Cathy, if you were aware whose house this is, you'd be glad enough to get out." "It's your father's, isn't it?" she said, turning to Hareton. "Nay," he replied, looking down and blushing bashfully. He could not stand a steady gaze from her eyes, though they were just his own. "Whose then? Your master's?" she asked. He colored deeper, with a different feeling, muttered an oath, and turned away. "Who's his master?" continued the tiresome girl, appealing to me. "He talked about our house and our folk. I thought he had been the owner's son. And he never said miss. He should have done, shouldn't he, if he's a servant?" Hareton grew black as a thundercloud at this childish speech. I silently shook my questioner, and at last succeeded in clipping her for departure. "Now, get my horse," she said, addressing her unknown kinsman as she would one of the stable boys at the Grange, "and you may come with me. I want to see where the goblin hunter rises in the march, and to hear about the farishes, as you call them. But make haste. What's the matter? Get my horse, I say." "I'll see thee damned before I be thy servant," growled the lad. "You'll see me what?" asked Catherine in surprise. "Damned, thou saucy witch," he replied. "There, Miss Cathy, you see you have got into pretty company," I interposed. "Nice words to be used to a young lady. Pray don't begin to dispute with him. Come, let us seek for Minnie ourselves and be gone." "But Helen," she cried, staring fixed in astonishment, "how dare he speak so to me? Mustn't he be made to do as I ask him? You wicked creature, I shall tell papa what you said. Now then." Hareton did not appear to feel this threat, so the tears sprang into her eyes with indignation. "You bring the pony," she exclaimed, turning to the woman, "and let my dog free this moment." "Softly, miss," answered she addressed. "You'll lose nothing by being civil. Though Mr. Hareton there be not the master's son, he's your cousin, and I was never hired to serve you." "He, my cousin?" cried Cathy with a scornful laugh. "Yes, indeed," responded her reprover. "Oh, Helen, don't let them say such things," she pursued in great trouble. "Papa is gone to fetch my cousin from London. My cousin is a gentleman's son. That my—" She stopped and wept outright, upset at the bare notion of relationship with such a clown. "Hush, hush," I whispered. "People can have many cousins and of all sorts, Miss Cathy, without being any the worse for it. Only they needn't keep their company, if they be disagreeable and bad." He's not my cousin, Ellen," she went on, gathering fresh grief from reflection, and flinging herself into my arms for refuge from the idea. I was much vexed at her and the servant for their mutual revelations, having no doubt of Linton's approaching arrival communicated by the former, being reported to Mr. Heathcliff, and feeling as confident that Catherine's first thought on her father's return would be to seek an explanation of the latter's assertion concerning her rude-bred kindred. Hareton, recovering from his disgust at being taken for a servant, seemed moved by her distress, and, having fetched the pony round to the door, he took, to propitiate her, a fine crooked-legged terrier whelp from the kennel, and putting it in her hand, bid her whist, for he meant naught. Pausing in her lamentations, she surveyed him with a glance of awe and horror, then burst forth anew. I could scarcely refrain from smiling at this antipathy to the poor fellow, who was a well-made, athletic youth, good-looking in features and stout and healthy, but attired in garments befitting his daily occupations of working on the farm and lounging among the moors after rabbits and game. Still, I thought I could detect in his physiognomy a mind owing better qualities than his father ever possessed. Good things lost amid a wilderness of weeds, to be sure, whose rankness far overtopped their neglected growth, yet, notwithstanding, evidence of a stealthy soil that might yield luxuriant crops under other and favorable circumstances. Mr. Heathcliff, I believe, had not treated him physically ill, thanks to his fearless nature, which offered no temptation to that course of oppression. He had none of the timid susceptibility that would have given zest to ill treatment, in Heathcliff's judgment. He appeared to have bent his malevolence on making him a brute. He was never taught to read or write, never rebuked for any bad habit which did not annoy his keeper, never led a single step towards virtue, or guarded by a single precept against vice, and from what I heard, Joseph contributed much to his deterioration by a narrow-minded partiality which prompted him to flatter and pet him as a boy, because he was the head of the old family. And as he had been in the habit of accusing Catherine Earnshaw and Heathcliff, when children, of putting the master past his patience and compelling him to seek solace in drink by what he termed their awful ways, so at present he laid the whole burden of Hareton's faults on the shoulders of the usurper of this property. If the lad swore, he wouldn't correct him, nor, however culpably, he behaved. It gave Joseph satisfaction, apparently, to watch him go the worst lengths. He allowed that the lad was ruined, that his soul was abandoned to perdition, but then he reflected that Heathcliff must answer for it. Hareton's blood would be required at his hands, and there lay immense consolation in that thought. Joseph had instilled into him a pride of name, and of his lineage he would, had he dared, have fostered hate between him and the present owner of the Heights, but his dread of that owner amounted to superstition, and he confined his feelings regarding him to muttered innuendos and private communications. I don't pretend to be intimately acquainted with the mode of living customary in those days at Wuthering Heights. I only speak from hearsay, for I saw little. The villagers affirmed Mr. Heathcliff was near, and a cruel, hard landlord to his tenants, but the house, inside, had regained its ancient aspect of comfort under female management, and the scenes of riot, common in Hindley's time, were not now enacted within its walls. The master was too gloomy to seek companionship with any people, good or bad, and he is yet. This, however, is not making progress with my story. Miss Cathy rejected the peace offering of the terrier, and demanded her own dogs, Charlie and Phoenix. They came limping and hanging their heads, and we set out for home, sadly out of sorts, every one of us. I could not wring from my little lady how she had spent the day, except that, as I supposed, the goal of her pilgrimage was Penistone Crags, and she arrived without adventure to the gates of the farmhouse, when Hareton happened to issue forth, attended by some canine followers, who attacked her train. They had a smart battle, before their owners could separate them, that formed an introduction. Catherine told Hareton who she was, and where she was going, and asked him to show her the way. Finally, beguiling him to accompany her, he opened the mysteries of the fairy cave and 20 other odd places. But, being in disgrace, I was not favored with the description of the interesting objects she saw. I could gather, however, that her guide had been a favorite till she hurt his feelings by addressing him as a servant, and Heathcliff's housekeeper hurt hers by calling him her cousin. Then the language he had held to her rankled in her heart. She who was always love and darling and queen and angel with everybody at the Grange, to be insulted so shockingly by a stranger. She did not comprehend it. and hard work I had to obtain a promise that she would not lay grievance before her father. I explained how he objected to the whole household at the Heights, and how sorry he would be to find she had been there, but I insisted most on the fact that if she revealed my negligence of his orders, he would perhaps be so angry that I should have to leave, and Kathy couldn't bear that prospect. She pledged her word, and kept it for my sake. After all, she was a sweet little girl. That is the end of chapter 18. Okay, so we have little Kathy. She is now 13 years old, and the whole time as she's growing up, she wants to explore the surroundings, but given the history of her family, her dad does not really let her go all that far. They pretty much stay in the Thrushcross Grange area. And so growing up, she sees far out into the distance, and she's like, I'm gonna go there when I'm older. And Ellen is like, oh, in due time, your dad will take you out there, blah, blah, blah. And one day she's 13 years old now, and she just gets a horse and she goes off. And Ellen realizes this and goes after her and finds her at Wuthering Heights. And she's there and hanging out with her cousin, who she learns is her cousin, Hareton. And she's having a great time and whatever. She doesn't really want to leave. And she's just confused at who Hareton is, and she offends him by calling him the servant of the house. After he's like, no, I'm not the son. And she's like, well, then obviously you're the servant, and your manners are terrible. And that offends Hareton. And the maid there was like, no, he's your cousin, and that offends Kathy. So everybody's offended. And then they leave, and like growing up, Kathy had only ever been called like super, super nice things, like, oh, you're so lovely, you're, a princess, you're an angel, all of these things. And then to be like treated as Hareton was treating her when he was offended didn't leave a great impression for her. And so she's a little salty about that, and like wanted her dad to be like, no, that's not true, my dad is gonna figure out everything. And Ellen is like, maybe we shouldn't tell your dad. And so everybody leaves like a little bit downtrodden, basically, including the dogs, which is sad. Poor little pups. Okay, chapter 19. A letter, edged with black, announced the day of my master's return. Isabella was dead, and he wrote to bid me get mourning for his daughter and arrange a room and other accommodations for his youthful nephew. Catherine ran wild with joy at the idea of welcoming her father back, and indulged most sanguine anticipations of the innumerable excellencies of her real cousin. The evening of their expected arrival came. Since early morning, she had been busy ordering her own small affairs, and now attired in her new black frock. Poor thing. Her aunt's death impressed her with no definite sorrow. She obliged me, by constant worrying, to walk with her down through the grounds to meet them. Linton is just 6 months younger than I am, she chattered, as she strolled leisurely over the swells and hollows of mossy turf, under the shadow of the trees. How delightful it will be to have him for a playfellow. Aunt Isabella sent Papa a beautiful lock of his hair. It was lighter than mine, more flaxen, and quite as fine. I have it carefully preserved in a little glass box, and I have often thought what a pleasure it would be to see its owner. Oh, I'm so happy. And Papa, dear, dear Papa. Come, Ellen, let us run. Come, run. She ran, and returned, and ran again, many times before my sober footsteps reached the gate, and then she seated herself on the grassy bank beside the path, and tried to wait patiently. But that was impossible. She couldn't be still a minute. How long they are, she exclaimed. Ah, I see some dust on the road. They are coming. No. When will they be here? May we not go a little way? Half a mile, Ellen, only just half a mile. Do say yes, to that clump of birches at the turn. I refused staunchly. At length her suspense was ended. The travelling carriage rolled in sight. Miss Cathy shrieked, and stretched out her arms as soon as she caught her father's face looking from the window. He descended, nearly as eager as herself, and a considerable interval elapsed ere they had a thought to spare for any but themselves. While they exchanged caresses, I took a peep in to see after Linton. He was asleep in a corner, wrapped in a warm, fur-lined cloak, as if it had been winter. A pale, delicate, effeminate boy, who might have been taken for my master's younger brother, so strong was the resemblance. But there was a sickly peevishness in his aspect that Edgar Linton never had. The latter saw me looking, and having shaken hands, advised me to close the door and leave him undisturbed, for the journey had fatigued him. Cathy would fain have taken one glance, but her father told her to come, and they walked together up the park, while I hastened before to prepare the servants. "Now, darling," said Mr. Linton, addressing his daughter as they halted at the bottom of the front steps, "your cousin is not strong or so merry as you are, and he has lost his mother, remember, a very short time since. Therefore, don't expect him to play and run about with you directly, and don't harass him much by talking. Let him be quiet this evening, at least. Will you?" "Yes, yes, papa," answered Catherine, "but I do want to see him, and he hasn't once looked out." The carriage stopped, and the sleeper, being roused, was lifted to the ground by his uncle. "This is your cousin, Cathy Linton," he said, putting their little hands together. "She's fond of you already, and mind you don't grieve her by crying tonight. Try to be cheerful now. The travelling is at an end, and you have nothing to do but rest and amuse yourself as you please." "Let me go to bed, then," answered the boy, shrinking from Catherine's salute, and he put his fingers to his eyes to remove incipient tears. "Come, come, there's a good child," I whispered, leading him in. "You'll make her weep too. See how sorry she is for you." I do not know whether it was sorrow for him, but his cousin put on as sad a countenance as himself, and returned to her father. All three entered, and mounted to the library, where tea was laid ready. I proceeded to remove Linton's cap and mantle, and placed him on a chair by the table. But he was no sooner seated than he began to cry afresh. My master inquired what was the matter. "I can't sit on a chair," sobbed the boy. "Go to the sofa, then, and Ellen shall bring you some tea," answered his uncle patiently. He had been greatly tired. He had been greatly tried during the journey, I felt convinced, by his fretful ailing charge. Linton slowly trailed himself off and lay down. Cathy carried a footstool and her cup to his side. At first she sat silent, but that could not last. She had resolved to make a pet of her little cousin, and she would have him to be. And she commenced stroking his curls and kissing his cheek, and offering him tea in her saucer, like a baby. This pleased him, for he was not much better. He dried his eyes and lightened into a faint smile. "Oh, he'll do very well," said the master to me, after watching them a minute. "Very well, if we can keep him, Ellen. The company of a child of his own age will instill new spirit into him soon, and by wishing for strength he'll gain it." "Aye, if we can keep him," I mused to myself, and sore misgivings came over me that there was slight hope of that. And then, I thought, how ever will that weakling live at Wuthering Heights? Between his father and Hareton, what playmates and instructors they'll be. Our doubts were presently decided, even earlier than I expected. I had just taken the children upstairs after tea was finished, and seen Linton asleep. He would not suffer me to leave him till that was the case. I had come down, and, standing by the table in the hall, lighting a bedroom candle for Mr. Edgar, when a maid stepped out of the kitchen and informed me that Mr. Heathcliff's servant Joseph was at the door, and wished to speak with the master. "I shall ask him what he wants first," I said in considerable trepidation. "A very unlikely hour to be troubling people. and the instant they have returned from a long journey. I don't think the master can see him." Joseph had advanced through the kitchen as I uttered these words, and now presented himself in the hall. He was donned in his Sunday garments, with his most sanctimonious and sourest face, and holding his hat in one hand and his stick in the other, he proceeded to clean his shoes on the mat. "Good evening, Joseph," I said coldly. "What business brings you here tonight?" "It's Master Linton I mun spake to," he answered, waving me disdainfully aside. "Mr. Linton is going to bed, unless you have something particular to say. I'm sure he won't hear it now," I continued. "You had better sit down in there and entrust your message to me." "Which is his ram?" pursued the fellow, surveying the range of closed doors. I perceived he was bent on refusing my mediation, so very reluctantly I went up to the library and announced the unseasonable visitor, advising that he should be dismissed till next day. Mr. Linton had no time to empower me to do so, for Joseph mounted close at my heels, and, pushing into the apartment, planted himself at the far side of the table, with his two fists clapped on the head of his stick, and began in an elevated tone, as if anticipating opposition. "Heathcliff has sent me for his lad, and I munt go back about him." Edgar Linton was silent a minute. An expression of exceeding sorrow overcast his features. He would have pitied the child on his own account, but, recalling Isabella's hopes and fears and anxious wishes for her son, and her commendations of him to his care, he grieved bitterly at the prospect of yielding him up, and searched in his heart how it might be avoided. No plan offered itself. The very exhibition of any desire to keep him would have rendered the claimant more peremptory. There was nothing left but to resign him. However, he was not growing to rouse him from his sleep. "Tell Mr. Heathcliff," he answered calmly, "that his son shall come to Wuthering Heights tomorrow. He is in bed, and too tired to go the distance now. You may also tell him that the mother of Linton desired him to remain under my guardianship, and, at present, his health is very precarious." "Nah," said Joseph, giving a thud with his prop on the floor, and assuming an authoritative air. "No, that means naught. Heathcliff makes no account to the mother, nor ye nother. But he'll have his lad, and I munt take him, so now ye know." But there is a little footnote, and it says Heathcliff doesn't care about the mother or you either. Thank you. "You shall not tonight," answered Linton decisively. "Walk downstairs at once, and repeat to your master what I have said. Elham, show him down. Go." And, aiding the indignant elder with a lift by the arm, he rid the room of him, and closed the door. "Very well," shouted Joseph, as he slowly drew off. "Tomorrow he come hisselin, and thrust him out, if ye dar." End of chapter 19. All right, so because Sister Isabella has died, Edgar went off to see to her arrangements and things like that, and also to grab her kid, his nephew, and Heathcliff's son, Linton. And so he brings him back. We find out that he's kind of sickly, super pale, and that the travels did not do well for him. And Kathy is just so excited that he's there. They're only 6 months apart, and she finally has like somebody to play with. And Ellen this time is thinking like, okay, well, we all know that he's gonna have to go back to Wuthering Heights, and we all know that there are no good examples for him over there. And so as everybody's getting ready for bed from just traveling, Joseph arrives and is like, okay, well, he literally just got here. And so Joseph is talking with Edgar and saying, like, Heathcliff needs him, I'm not leaving without him. And Edgar's like, you're not taking him right now. He's sickly. We just got home and he's sleeping. He will be there tomorrow. And Joseph is like, all right, Heathcliff is coming tomorrow. Try and throw him out. And that's where we ended. Chapter 20. To obviate the danger of this threat being fulfilled, Mr. Linton commissioned me to take the boy home early on Catherine's pony, and, said he, as we shall now have no influence over his destiny, good or bad, you must say nothing of where he is gone to my daughter. She cannot associate with him hereafter, and it is better for her to remain in ignorance of his proximity, lest she should be restless and anxious to visit the Heights. Merely tell her his father sent for him suddenly, and he has been obliged to leave us. Linton was very reluctant to be roused from his bed at 5 o'clock, and astonished to be informed that he must prepare for further travelling. But I softened off the matter by stating that he was going to spend some time with his father, Mr. Heathcliff, who wished to see him so much. He did not like to defer the pleasure till he should he recover from his journeys. My father, he cried in strange perplexity. Mamma never told me I had a father. Where does he live? I'd rather stay with uncle. He lives a little distance from the Grange, I replied, just beyond those hills, not so far. But you may walk over here when you get hardy, and you should be glad to go home, and to see him. You must try to love him, as you did your mother, and then he will love you. But why have I not heard of him before? asked Linton. Why didn't Mamma and he live together, as other people do? He had business to keep him in the north, I answered, and your mother's health required her to reside in the south. And why didn't Mamma speak to me about him? Persevered the child. She often talked of uncle, and I learnt to love him long ago. How am I to love Papa? I don't know him. Oh, all children love their parents, I said. Your mother, perhaps, thought you would want to be with him if she mentioned him often to you. Let us make haste. An early ride on such a beautiful morning is much preferable to an hour's more sleep. Is she to go with us? He demanded. The little girl I saw yesterday. Not now, replied Uncle. Is Uncle? He continued. No, I shall be your companion there, I said. Linton sank back on his pillow and fell into a brown study. I won't go without Uncle, he cried at length. I can't tell where you mean to take me. I attempted to persuade him of the naughtiness of showing reluctance to meet his father. Still, he obstinately resisted any progress towards dressing, and I had to call for my master's assistance in coaxing him out of bed. The poor thing was finally got off, with several delusive assurances that his absence should be short, that Mr. Edgar and Cathy would visit him, and other promises, equally ill-founded, which I invented and reiterated at intervals throughout the way. The pure, heather-scented air, the bright sunshine, and the gentle canter of Minnie relieved his despondency after a while. He began to put questions concerning his new home and its inhabitants with greater interest and liveliness. Is Wuthering Heights as pleasant a place as Thrushcross Grange? He inquired, turning to take a last glance into the valley, whence a light mist mounted and formed a fleecy cloud on the skirts of the blue. It is not so buried in trees, I replied, and it is not quite so large, but you can see the country beautifully all round, and the air is healthier for you, fresher and drier. You will, perhaps, think the building old and dark at first, though it is a respectable house, the next best in the neighbourhood, and you will have such nice rambles on the moor. Catherine Earnshaw, that is Miss Cathy's other cousin, and yours in a manner, will show you all the sweetest spots, and you can bring a book in fine weather, and make a green hollow your study, and now and then your uncle may join you in a well. He does frequently walk out onto the hills. And what is my father like? He asked. Is he as young and handsome as uncle? He's as young, said I, but he has black hair and eyes and looks sterner, and he is taller and bigger altogether. He'll not seem to you so gentle and kind at first, perhaps, because it is not his way. Still, mind you, be frank and cordial with him, and naturally he'll be fonder of you than any uncle, for you are his own. Black hair and eyes, mused Linton. I can't fancy him. Then I am not like him, am I? Not much, I answered. Not a morsel, I thought, surveying with regret the white complexion and slim frame of my companion, and his large, languid eyes, his mother's eyes, save that, unless a morbid touchiness kindled them a moment, they had not a vestige of her sparkling spirit. How strange that he should never come to see mamma and me, he muttered. Has he never seen me? If he has, I must have been a baby. I remember not a single thing about him. Why, Master Linton, said I, 300 miles is a great distance, and 10 years seems very different in length to a grown-up person compared with what they do to you. It is probable Mr. Heathcliff proposed going from summer to summer, but never found a convenient opportunity. And now it is too late. Don't trouble him with questions on the subject. It will disturb him, for no good. The boy was fully occupied with his own cogitations for the remainder of the ride, till we halted before the farmhouse garden gate. I watched to catch his impressions in his countenance. He surveyed the carved front and low-browed lattices, the straggling gooseberry bushes and crooked firs, with solemn intentness, and then shook his head. His private feelings entirely disapproved of the exterior of his new abode, but he had sense to postpone complaining. There might be compensation within. Before he dismounted, I went and opened the door. It was 6:30. The family had just finished breakfast. The servant was cleaning and wiping down the table. Joseph stood by his master's chair, telling some tale concerning a lame horse, and Hareton was preparing for the hayfield. "Hello, Nellie," said Mr. Heathcliff when he saw me. "I feared I should have to come down and fetch my property myself. You've brought it, have you? Let us see what we can make of it." He got up and strode to the door. Hareton and Joseph followed in gaping curiosity. Poor Linton ran a frightened eye over the faces of the three. "Surely," said Joseph, after grave inspection, "he's swapped with ye maester, and yon's his lass." Heathcliff, having stared his son into an ague of confusion, uttered a scornful laugh. "God, what a beauty! What a lovely, charming thing!" he exclaimed. "Haven't they reared it on snails and sour milk, Nellie? Damned my soul, but that's worse than I expected, and the devil knows it was not sanguine." I bid the trembling and bewildered child get down and enter. He did not thoroughly comprehend the meaning of his father's speech, or whether it were intended for him. Indeed, he was not yet certain that the grim, sneering stranger was his father. But he clung to me with growing trepidation, and on Mr. Heathcliff's taking a seat and bidding him come hither, he hid his face on my shoulder and wept. "Tut, tut," said Heathcliff, stretching out a hand and dragging him roughly between his knees, and then holding up his head by the chin. "None of that nonsense. We're not going to hurt thee, Linton. Isn't that thy name? Thou art thy mother's child entirely. Where is my share in thee? Pulling chicken?" He took off the boy's cap, and pushed back his thick flaxen curls, felt his slender arms and his small fingers, during which examination Linton ceased crying, and lifted his great blue eyes to inspect the inspector. "Do you know me?" asked Heathcliff, having satisfied himself that the limbs were all equally frail and feeble. "No," said Linton, with a gaze of vacant fear. "You've heard of me, I dare say?" "No," he replied again. "No! What a shame of your mother, never to waken your filial regard for me. You are my son, then, I'll tell you, and your mother was a wicked person to leave you in ignorance of the sort of father you possessed. Now, don't wince and color up, though it is something to you to see you not have white blood. Be a good lad, and I'll do for you. Nelly, if you be tired, you may sit down. If not, get home again. I guess you'll report what you hear and see to the cipher at the Grange, and this thing won't be settled while you linger about it. Well, replied I hope you'll be kind to the boy, Mr. Heathcliff, or you'll not keep him long, and he's all you have akin to the wide world, that you will ever know. Remember. I'll be very kind to him. You needn't fear, he said, laughing. Only nobody else must be kind to him. I'm jealous of monopolizing his affection, and to begin my kindness, Joseph, bring the lad some breakfast. Hareton, you infernal calf, begone to your work. Yes, Nell, he added, when they had departed, my son is prospective owner of your place, and I should not wish him to die till I was certain of being his successor. Besides, he's mine, and I want the triumph of seeing my descendant fairly lord of their estates, my child hiring their children to till their father's land for wages. That is the sole consideration which can make me endure this whelp. I despise him for myself, and hate him for the memories he revives. But that consideration is sufficient. He's as safe with me, and shall be tended as carefully as your master tends his own. I have a room upstairs, furnished for him in handsome style. I've engaged a tutor, also, to come 3 times a week, from 20 miles distance, to teach him what he pleases to learn. I've ordered Hareton to obey him, and in fact I've arranged everything with a view to preserve the superior and gentleman in him above his associates. I do not regret, however, that he so little deserves the trouble. If I wished any blessing in the world, it was to find him a worthy object of pride, and I'm bitterly disappointed with the whey-faced, whiny wretch. While he was speaking, Joseph returned bearing a basin of milk porridge, and placed it before Linton, who stirred round the homely mess with a look of aversion, and affirmed he could not eat it. I saw the old man-servant shared largely in his master's scorn for the child, though he was compelled to retain the sentiment in his heart, because Heathcliff plainly meant his underlings to hold him in honour. Cannot eat it, repeated he, peering at Linton's face and subduing his voice to a whisper for fear of being overheard. But Maester Harrington never ate naught else, when he were a little un, and what you're good enough for him's good enough for is, I'd rather think. I shan't eat it, answered Linton, snappishly. Take it away. Joseph snatched up the food indignantly, and brought it to us. If there aught ails the victuals, he asked, thrusting the tray under Heathcliff's nose. What should ail him? Ail them, he says. Wah, answered Joseph. Yon dainty chap says he cannot eat 'em, but I guess he's right. His mother were just so. We were a'most too mucky to sow to corn for bacon and bread. Don't mention his mother to me, said the master angrily. Get him something that he can eat, that's all. What is his usual food, Nelly? I suggested boiled milk or tea, and the housekeeper received instructions to prepare some. Come, I reflected his father's selfishness may contribute to his comfort. He perceives his delicate constitution and the necessity of treating him tolerably. I'll console Mr. Edgar by acquainting him with the turn Heathcliff's humour has taken. Having no excuse for lingering longer, I slipped out, while Linton was engaged in timidly rebuffing the advances of a friendly sheepdog. But he was too much on the alert to be cheated. As I closed the door, I heard a cry, and a frantic repetition of the words, "Don't leave me! I'll not stay here! I'll not stay here!" Then the latch was raised and fell. They did not suffer him to come forth. I mounted Minnie, and urged her to a trot, and so my brief guardianship ended. End of chapter 20. Alright, so chapter 20. Ellen awakens little Linton to take him to Wuthering Heights because Heathcliff deems it so, because he is Heathcliff's son. So Linton is meeting his father, whom he didn't even know that he had, because obviously Isabella wouldn't have talked about him very much. And so Linton is going over there, and like always, Heathcliff and Wuthering Heights leaves quite an impression. And Linton is terrified. He's very frail and small and like not fully recovered from traveling yet. And just having led a different life for the past like 10 years. And this whole time, like as they're traveling, Ellen is trying to be very generous in how she talks about Heathcliff and being like, oh well, he never came to see you because time works differently, and things like that. Just like, well, of course you'll love him and he'll love you, and blah blah blah. And Linton is a little like doesn't want to go because he's not going to know anybody, all of these things. He's a little scared, all of these stuff. And he gets there, and Heathcliff is just being Heathcliff, and Joseph is being Joseph, but they do give him different food. And Heathcliff is like, well, I've already told everybody that they need to obey him, and as they obey me, and blah blah blah. And Linton, as Ellen is leaving and mounted Minnie, Linton is like screaming to go back home and for Ellen to come back and get him. And it's so sad. He's so scared. Just this scared boy. Okay. Chapter 21. Oof. We had sad work with little Kathy that day. She rose in high glee, eager to join her cousin, and such passionate tears and lamentations followed the news of his departure that Edgar himself was obliged to soothe her by affirming he should come back soon. He added, however, if I can get him, and there were no hopes of that. This promise poorly pacified her, but time was more potent, and though still at intervals she inquired of her father when Linton would return, before she did see him again, his features had waxed so dim in her memory that she did not recognize him. When I chanced to encounter the housekeeper of Wuthering Heights in paying business visits to Gimmerton, I used to ask how the young master got on, for he lived almost as secluded as Catherine herself, and was never to be seen. I could gather from her that he continued in weak health, and was a tiresome inmate. She said Mr. Heathcliff seemed to dislike him ever longer and worse, though he took some trouble to conceal it. He had an antipathy to the sound of his voice, and could not do at all with his sitting in the same room with him many minutes together. There seldom passed much talk between them. Linton learnt his lessons, and spent his evenings in a small apartment they called the parlour, or else lay in bed all day, for he was constantly getting coughs, and colds, and aches, and pains of some sort. And I never know such a faint-hearted creature, added the woman, nor one so careful to hisseln. He will go on, if I leave the window open a bit late in the evening. Oh, it's killing, a breath of night air. And he must have a fire in the middle of summer, and Joseph's bacca pipe is poison, and he must always have sweets and dainties, and always milk forever, heeding not how the rest of us are pinched in winter. And there he'll sit, wrapped in his fur cloak, in his chair by the fire, with some toast and water or other slop on the hob to sit at. And if Hareton, for pity, comes to amuse him, Hareton is not bad-natured, though he's rough, and they're sure to part, one swearing and the other crying. I believe the master would relish Earnshaw's thrashing him to a mummy if he were not his son, and I'm certain he would be fit to turn him out of doors if he knew half the nursing he gives Hisselin. But then he won't go into danger of temptation. He never enters the parlour, and should Linton show those ways in the house where he is, he spends him upstairs directly. I divined from this account that utter lack of sympathy had rendered young Heathcliff selfish and disagreeable, if he were not so originally, and my interest in him, consequently, decayed, though still I was moved with a sense of grief at his lot, and a wish that he had been left with us. Mr. Edgar encouraged me to gain information. He thought a great deal about him, I fancy, and would have run some risk to see him, and he told me once to ask the housekeeper whether he ever came into the village. She said he had only been twice, on horseback accompanying his father, and both times he pretended to be quite knocked up for 3 or 4 days afterwards. That housekeeper left, if I recollect rightly, 2 years after he came, and another, whom I did not know, was her successor. She lives there still. Time wore on at the Grange in its former pleasant way till Miss Cathy reached 16. On the anniversary of her birth we never manifested any signs of rejoicing, because it was also the anniversary of my late mistress's death. Her father invariably spent that day alone in the library and walked at dusk as far as Gimmerton Kirkyard, where he would frequently prolong his stay beyond midnight. Therefore, Catherine was thrown on her own resources for amusement. This 20th of March was a beautiful spring day, and when her father had retired, my young lady came down, dressed for going out, and said she asked to have a ramble on the edge of the moor with me. Mr. Linton had given her leave, if we only went a short distance and were back within the hour. So make haste, Ellen, she cried. I know where I wish to go, where a colony of moor game are settled. I want to see whether they have made their nests yet. That must be a good distance up, I answered. They don't breed on the edge of the moor. No, it's not, she said. I've gone very near with Papa. I put on my bonnet and sallied out, thinking nothing more of the matter. She bounded before me and returned to my side, and was off again like a young greyhound, and, at first, I found plenty of entertainment in listening to the larks singing far and near, and enjoying the sweet, warm sunshine, and watching her, my pet and my delight, with her golden ringlets flying loose behind, and her bright cheek as soft and pure in its bloom as a wild rose, and her eyes radiant with cloudless pleasure. She was a happy creature, and an angel, in those days. It's a pity she could not be content. Well, said I, where are your moor game, Miss Cathy? We should be at them. The Grange park fence is a great way off now. Oh, a little farther. Only a little further, Ellen, was her answer, continually. Climb to that hillock, past that bank, and by the time you reach the other side, I shall have raised the birds. But there were so many hillocks and banks to climb and pass that, at length, I began to weary, and told her we must halt and retrace our steps. I shouted to her, as she had outstripped me a long way. She either did not hear, or did not regard, for she still sprang on, and I was compelled to follow. Finally, she dived into a hollow, and before I came in sight of her again, she was 2 miles nearer Wuthering Heights than her own home. And I beheld a couple of persons arrest her, one of whom I felt convinced was Mr. Heathcliff himself. Cathy had been caught in the fact of plundering, or at least hunting out the nets of the grouse. The heights were Heathcliff's land, and he was reproving the poacher. I've never taken any, nor found any, she said as I toiled to them, expanding her hands in corroboration of the statement. I didn't mean to take them, but Papa told me there were quantities up here, and I wished to see the eggs. Heathcliff glanced at me with an ill-meaning smile, expressing his acquaintance with the party and, consequently, his malevolence towards it, and demanded who Papa was. Mr. Linton of Thrushcross Grange, she replied. I thought you did not know me, or you wouldn't have spoken in that way. Your papa is highly esteemed and respected, then? He said sarcastically. And what are you? Inquired Catherine, gazing curiously on the speaker. That man I've seen before. Is he your son? She pointed at Hareton, the other individual who had gained nothing but increased bulk and strength by the addition of 2 years to his age. He seemed as awkward and rough as ever. "Miss Cathy," I interrupted, "it will be 3 hours instead of 1 that we are out presently. We really must go back." "No, that man is not my son," answered Heathcliff, pushing me aside. "But I have one, and you have seen him before too, and, though your nurse is in a hurry, I think both you and she would be better for a little rest. Will you just turn this nab of health and walk into my house? You'll get home earlier for the ease, and you shall receive a kind welcome." I whispered Catherine that she mustn't, on any account, accede to the proposal. It was entirely out of the question. "Why?" she asked aloud. "I'm tired of running, and the ground is dewy. I can't sit here. Let us go, Ellen. Besides, he says I have seen his son. He's mistaken, I think. But I guess where he lives, at the farmhouse I visited in coming from Penistone Crags, don't you?" "I do. Come, Nellie. Hold your tongue. It will be a treat for her to look in on us. Hareton, get forwards with the lass. You shall walk with me, Nellie." It was Heathcliff. "No, she's not going to any such place," I cried, struggling to release my arm, which he had seized. But she was almost at the door-stones already, scampering round the brow at full speed. Her appointed companion did not pretend to escort her. He shied off the roadside and vanished. "Mr. Heathcliff, it's very wrong," I continued. "You know you mean no good. And there she'll see Linton, and all will be told as soon as ever we return, and I shall have the blame." "I want her to see Linton," he answered. "He's looking better these few days. It's not often he's fit to be seen, and we'll soon persuade her to keep the visit secret. Where's the harm of it?" "The harm of it is that her father would hate me if he found I suffered her to enter your house, and I am convinced you have a bad design in encouraging her to do so," I replied. "My design is as honest as possible. I'll inform you of its whole scope," he said. "That the 2 cousins may fall in love and get married. I'm acting generously to your master. His young chit has no expectations, and should she second my wishes, she'll have provided for at once as joint successor with Linton." "If Linton died," I answered, "and his life is quite uncertain, Catherine would be the heir." "No, she would not," he said. "There is no clause in the will to secure it so. His property would go to me, but, to prevent disputes, I desire their union, and am resolved to bring it about." "And I'm resolved she shall never approach your house with me again," I returned, as we reached the gate where Miss Cathy waited our coming. Heathcliff bade me to be quiet, and, preceding us up the path, hastened to open the door. My young lady gave him several looks as if she could not exactly make up her mind what to think of him. But now she smiled when he met her eyes, and softened his voice in addressing her, and I was foolish enough to imagine the memory of her mother might disarm him from desiring her injury. Linton stood on the hearth. He had been out walking in the fields, for his cap was on, and he was calling to Joseph to bring him dry shoes. He had grown tall of his age, still wanting some months of 16. His features were pretty yet, and his eye and complexion brighter than I remembered them, though with merely temporary lustre, borrowed from the salubrious air and genial sun. "Now, who is that?" asked Mr. Heathcliff, turning to Cathy. "Can you tell?" "Your son?" she said, having doubtfully surveyed first one, then the other. "Yes, yes," he answered. "But is this the only time you have beheld him? Think! You have such a short memory. Linton, don't you recall your cousin, that you used to tease us so with wishing to see?" "What? Linton?" cried Cathy, kindling into joyful surprise at the name. "Is that little Linton? He's taller than I am. Are you Linton?" The youth stepped forward and acknowledged himself. She kissed him fervently, and they gazed with wonder at the change time had wrought in their appearance of each. Catherine had reached her full height. Her figure was both plump and slender, elastic as steel, and her whole aspect sparkling with health and spirits. Linton's looks and movements were more languid, and his form extremely slight, but there was a grace in his manner that mitigated these defects, and rendered him not unpleasing. After exchanging numerous marks of fondness with him, his cousin went to Mr. Heathcliff, who lingered by the door, dividing his attention between the objects inside and those that lay without. Pretending, that is, to observe the latter, and really noting the former only. "And you are my uncle, then?" she cried, reaching up to salute him. "I thought I liked you, though you were cross at first. Why don't you visit at the Grange with Linton? To live all these years such close neighbours and never see us is odd. What have you done so far?" "I visited it once or twice, too, often before you were born," he answered. "There, damn it. If you have any kisses to spare, give them to Linton. They are thrown away on me." "Naughty Ellen!" exclaimed Catherine, flying to attack me next with her lavish caresses. "Wicked Ellen, to try to hinder me from entering. But I'll take this walk every morning in future. May I, uncle? And sometimes bring papa. Won't you be glad to see us?" "Of course," replied the uncle, with a hearty, suppressed grimace, resulting from his deep aversion to both the proposed visitors. "But stay," he continued, turning towards the young lady. "Now I think of it, I'd better tell you. Mr. Linton has a prejudice against me. We quarrelled at one time of our lives, with unchristian ferocity, and, if you mention coming here to him, he'll put a veto on your visits altogether. Therefore you must not mention it, unless you be careless of seeing your cousin hereafter. You may come, if you will, but you must not mention it." "Why did you quarrel?" asked Catherine, considerably crestfallen. "He thought me too poor to wed his sister," answered Heathcliff, "and was grieved that I got her. His pride was hurt, and he'll never forget it." "That's wrong," said the young lady. "Some time I'll tell him so. But Linton and I have no share in your quarrel. I'll not come here then. He shall come to the Grange." "It will be too far for me," murmured her cousin. "To walk 4 miles would kill me. No, come here, Miss Catherine, now and then, not every morning, but once or twice a week." The father launched towards his son a glance of bitter contempt. "I'm not afraid, Nelly. I shall lose my labour," he muttered to me. "Miss Catherine, as a ninny calls her, will discover his value and send him to the devil. Now, if it has been Hareton, do you know that 20 times a day I covet Hareton with all his degradation? I'd have loved the lad had he been someone else, but I think he's safe from her love. I'll pit him against that paltry creature, unless it bestir itself briskly. We calculate it scarcely last till it is 18. Oh, confound the vapid thing! He's absorbed in drying his feet, and never looks at her. Linton." "Yes, father," answered the boy. "Have you nothing to show your cousin anywhere about? Not even a rabbit or a weasel's nest? Take her into the garden, before you change your shoes, and into the stable to your horse." "Wouldn't you rather sit here?" asked Linton, addressing Cathy in a tone which expressed reluctance to move again. "I don't know," she replied, casting a longing look at the door and evidently eager to be active. He kept his seat and shrank closer to the fire. Heathcliff rose and went into the kitchen, and from thence to the yard, calling out for Hareton. Hareton responded, and presently the two re-entered. The young man had been washing himself, as was visible by the glow of his cheeks and his wetted hair. "Oh, I'll ask you, uncle," cried Miss Cathy, recollecting the housekeeper's assertion. "That is not my cousin, is he?" "Yes," he replied. "Your mother's nephew. Don't you like him?" Catherine looked odd. "Is he not a handsome lad?" he continued. The uncivil little thing stood on tiptoe and whispered a sentence into Heathcliff's ear. He laughed. Hareton darkened. I perceived he was very sensitive to suspected slights, and had obviously a dim notion of his inferiority. But his master or guardian chased the frown by exclaiming, "You'll be the favourite among us, Hareton. She says you are a What was it? Well, something very flattering. Here, you go wish her round the farm, and behave like a gentleman, mind. Don't use any bad words, and don't stare when the young lady is not looking at you, and be ready to hide your face when she is. And when you speak, say your words slowly, and keep your hands out of your pockets. Be out, and entertain her as nicely as you can." He watched the couple walking past the window. Earnshaw had his countenance completely averted from his companion. He seemed studying the familiar landscape with a stranger's and an artist's interest. Catherine took a sly look at him, expressing small admiration. She then turned her attention to seeking out objects of amusement for herself, and tripped merrily on, lilting a tune to supply the lack of conversation. "I've tied his tongue," observed Heathcliff. "He'll not venture a single syllable all the time. Nelly, you recollect me at this age, nay, some years younger? Did I ever look so stupid, so gaumless, as Joseph calls it?" "Worse," I replied, because more sullen with it. "I have a pleasure in him," he continued, reflecting aloud. "He has satisfied my expectations. If he were a born fool, I should not enjoy it half so much, but he's no fool, and I can sympathize with all his feelings, having felt them myself. I know what he suffers now, for instance, exactly. It is merely a beginning of what he shall suffer, though, and he'll never be able to emerge from his bathos of coarseness and ignorance. I've got him faster than his scoundrel of a father secured me, and lower, for he takes a pride in his brutishness. I've taught him to scorn everything extra-animal, as silly and weak. Don't you think Hindley would be proud of his son, if he could see him, almost as proud as I am of mine? But there's this difference. One is gold put to the use of paving stones, and the other is tin polished to ape a service of silver. Mine has nothing valuable about it. Yet I shall have the merit of making it go as far as such poor stuff can go. His had first-rate qualities, and they are lost, rendered worse than unavailing. I have nothing to regret. He would have more than any but I are aware of. And the best of it, Hareton is damnably fond of me. You'll own that I've outmatched Hindley there. If the dead villain could rise from his grave to abuse me for his offspring's wrongs, I should have the fun of seeing the said offspring fight him back again, indignant that he should dare to rail at the one friend he has in the world." Heathcliff chuckled a fiendish laugh at the idea. I made no reply, because I saw that he expected none. Meantime our young companion, who sat too removed from us to hear what was said, began to evince symptoms of uneasiness, probably repenting that he had denied himself the treat of Catherine's society for fear of a little fatigue. His father remarked the restless glances wandering to the window, and the hand irresolutely extended towards his cap. "Get up, you idle boy," he exclaimed, with assumed heartiness. "Away after them. They are just at the corner by the stand of hives." Linton gathered his energies and left the hearth. The lattice was open, and as he stepped out, I heard Cathy inquiring of her unsociable attendant what was that inscription over the door. Hareton stared up and scratched his head like a true clown. "It's some damnable writing," he answered. "I cannot read it." "Can't read it?" cried Catherine. "I can read it. It's English. But I want to know why it is there." Linton giggled, the first appearance of mirth he had exhibited. "He does not know his letters," he said to his cousin. "Could you believe in the existence of such a colossal dunce?" Is he all as he should be?" asked Cathy seriously. "Or is he simple, not right? I've questioned him twice now, and each time he looked so stupid, I think he does not understand me. I can hardly understand him, I'm sure." Linton repeated his laugh and glanced at Hareton tauntingly, who certainly did not seem quite clear of comprehension at that moment. "There's nothing the matter but laziness, is there, Earnshaw?" he said. "My cousin fancies you are an idiot. There you experience the consequences of scorning book-larnin, as you would say. Have you noticed, Catherine, his frightful Yorkshire pronunciation?" "Why, the devil is in the usedn't," growled Hareton, more ready in answering his daily companion. He was about to enlarge further, but the two youngsters broke into a noisy fit of merriment, my giddy miss being delighted to discover that she might turn his strange talk to matter of amusement. "Where is the use of the devil in that sentence?" tittered Linton. "Papa told you not to say any bad words, and you can't open your mouth without one. Do try to behave like a gentleman. Now do." "If thou weren't more a lass than a lad, I'd fell thee this minute, I would, pitiful laugh of a crater," retorted the angry boor, retreating, while his face burnt with mingled rage and mortification, for he was conscious of being insulted, and embarrassed how to resent it. Mr. Heathcliff, having overheard the conversation as well as I, smiled when he saw them go, but immediately afterwards cast a look of singular aversion on the flippant pair, who remained chattering in the doorway, the boy finding animation enough while discussing Hareton's faults and deficiencies, and relating anecdotes of his goings-on, and the girl relishing his pert and spiteful sayings without considering the ill nature they evinced. I began to dislike, more than to compassionate, Linton, and to excuse his father in some measure for holding him cheap. We stayed till afternoon. I could not tear Miss Cathy away sooner, but happily my master had not quitted his apartment, and remained ignorant of our prolonged absence. As we walked home, I could fain have enlightened my charge on the characters of the people who had quitted, but she got it into her head that I was prejudiced against them. "Ah," she cried, "you take papa's side, Ellen. You are partial, I know, or else you wouldn't have cheated me so many years into the notion that Linton lived a long way from here. I'm really extremely angry, only I'm so pleased I can't show it. But you must hold your tongue about my uncle. He's my uncle, remember, and I'll scold papa for quarrelling with him." And so she ran on, till I relinquished the endeavour to convince her of her mistake. She did not mention the visit that night, because she did not see Mr. Linton. Next day it all came out, sadly, to my chagrin, and still I was not altogether sorry. I thought the burden of directing and warming would be more efficiently borne by him than me, but he was too timid in giving satisfactory reasons for his wish that she should shun connection with the household of the Heights, and Catherine liked good reasons for every restraint that harassed her petted will. "Papa," she exclaimed after the morning's salutations, "guess whom I saw yesterday in my walk on the moors? Oh, papa, you started. You're not done right, have you now? I saw, but listen, you shall hear how I found you out, and Ellen, who is in league with you, and yet pretended to pity me so when I kept hoping, and was always disappointed about Linton's coming back." She gave a faithful account of her excursion and its consequences, and my master, though he cast more than one reproachful look at me, said nothing till she had concluded. Then he drew her to him, and asked if she knew why he had concealed Linton's near neighbourhood from her. Could she think it was to deny her a pleasure that she might harmlessly enjoy? "It was because you disliked Mr. Heathcliff," she answered. "Then you believe I care more for my own feelings than yours, Cathy?" he asked. "No, it is not because I disliked Mr. Heathcliff, but because Mr. Heathcliff dislikes me, and is a most diabolical man, delighting to wrong and ruin those he hates, if they give him the slightest opportunity. I knew that you could not keep up an acquaintance with your cousin without being brought into contact with him, and I knew he would detest you on my account, so for your own good, and nothing else, I took precautions that you should not see Linton again. I meant to explain this sometime as you grew older, and I'm sorry I delayed it." "But Mr. Heathcliff was quite cordial, papa," observed Catherine, not at all convinced, "and he didn't object to our seeing each other. He said I might come to the house when I pleased. Only I must not tell you because you had quarrelled with him, and would not forgive him for marrying Aunt Isabella. And you won't. You are the one to be blamed. He is willing to let us be friends, at least. Linton and I, and you are not. My master, perceiving that she would not take his word for her uncle-in-law's evil disposition, gave a hasty sketch of his conduct to Isabella, and the manner in which Wuthering Heights became his property. He could not bear to discourse long upon this topic, for though he spoke little of it, he still felt the same horror and detestation of his ancient enemy that had occupied his heart ever since Mrs. Linton's death. She might have been living yet if it had not been for him, was his constant bitter reflection, and in his eyes Heathcliff seemed a murderer. Miss Cathy, conversant with no bad deeds except her own slight acts of disobedience, injustice, and passion, arising from hot temper and thoughtlessness, and repented of on the day they were committed, was amazed at the blackness of spirit that could brood on and cover revenge for years, and deliberately prosecute its plans without a visitation of remorse. She appeared so deeply impressed and shocked at this new view of human nature, excluded from all her studies and all her ideas till now, that Mr. Edgar deemed it unnecessary to pursue the subject. He merely added, "You will know hereafter, darling, why I wish you to avoid his house and family. Now return to your old employments and amusements, and think no more about them." Catherine kissed her father, and sat down quietly to her lessons for a couple hours, according to custom. Then she accompanied him into the grounds, and the whole day passed as usual. But in the evening, when she had retired to her rooms, and I went to help her to undress, I found her crying, on her knees by the bedside. "Oh, fie, silly child," I exclaimed. "If you had any real griefs, you'd be ashamed to waste a tear on this little contrariety. You never have one shadow of substantial sorrow, Miss Catherine. Suppose, for a minute, that master and I were dead, and you were by yourself in the world. How would you feel then? Compare the present occasion with such an affliction as that, and be thankful for the friends you have, instead of coveting more." "I'm not crying for myself, Ellen," she answered. "It's for him. He expected to see me again tomorrow, and there he'll be so disappointed, and he'll wait for me, and I shan't come." "Nonsense," said I. "Do you imagine he has thought as much of you as you have of him? Hasn't he Hareton for a companion? Not 1 in 100 would sweep at losing a relation they had just seen twice, for 2 afternoons. Linton will conjecture how it is, and trouble himself no further about you." "But may I not write a note to tell him why I cannot come?" she asked, rising to her feet, "and just send those books I promised to lend him. His books are not as nice as mine, and he wanted to have them extremely when I told him how interesting they were. May I not, Ellen?" "No, indeed, no, indeed," replied I with decision. "Then he could write to you, and there'd be never an end of it. No, Miss Catherine, the acquaintance must be dropped entirely, so papa expects, and I shall see that it is done." "But how can one little note—" she recommenced, putting on an imploring countenance. "Silence," I interrupted. "We'll not begin with your little notes. Get into bed." She threw at me a very naughty look, so naughty that I would not kiss her good night at first. I covered her up and shut her door, in great displeasure, but, repenting halfway, I returned softly, and lo, there was Miss standing at the table with a bit of blank paper before her, and a pencil in her hand, which she guiltily slipped out of sight on my entrance. "You'll get nobody to take that, Catherine," I said, "if you write it, and at present I shall put out your candle." I set the extinguisher on the flame, receiving as I did so a slap on my hand and a petulant "Cross thing!" I then quitted her again, and she drew the bolt in one of her worst, most peevish humours. The letter was finished, and forwarded to its destination by a milk-fetcher who came from the village, but that I didn't learn till some time afterwards. Weeks passed on, and Cathy recovered her temper, though she grew wondrous fond of stealing off to corners by herself, and often if I came near her suddenly while reading, she would start and bend over the book, evidently desirous to hide it, and I detected edges of loose paper sticking out beyond the leaves. She also got a trick of coming down early in the morning and lingering about the kitchen, as if she were expecting the arrival of something. And she had a small drawer in a cabinet in the library, which she would trifle over for hours, and whose key she took special care to remove when she left it. One day, as she inspected this drawer, I observed that the playthings and trinkets which recently formed its contents were transmitted into bits of folded paper. My curiosity and suspicions were roused. I determined to take a peep at her mysterious treasures. So, at night, as soon as she and my master were safe upstairs, I searched, and readily found among my house keys one that would fit the lock. Having opened, I emptied the whole contents into my apron and took them with me to examine at leisure my own chamber. Though I could not but suspect, I was still surprised to discover that they were a mass of correspondence. Daily, almost, it must have been, from Linton Heathcliff, answers to documents forwarded by her. The earlier dated were embarrassed and short. Gradually, however, they expanded into copious love letters, foolish as the age of the writer rendered natural, yet with touches here and there which I thought were borrowed from a more experienced source. Some of them struck me as singularly odd compounds of ardor and flatness, commencing in strong feeling and concluding in the affected, wordy style that a schoolboy might use to a fancied, incorporeal sweetheart. Whether they satisfied Kathy, I don't know, but they appeared very worthless trash to me. After turning over as many as I thought proper, I tied them in a handkerchief and sent them aside, relocking the vacant drawer. Following her habit, my young lady descended early and visited the kitchen. I watched her go to the door on the arrival of a certain little boy, and while the dairymaid filled his can, she tucked something into his jacket pocket and plucked something out. I went round by the garden and laid wait for the messenger, who fought valorously to defend his trust, and we spilt the milk between us. But I succeeded in abstracting the epistle, and, threatening serious consequences if he did not look sharp home, I remained under the wall and persuaded Miss Cathy's affectionate composition. It was more simple and more eloquent than her cousin's, very pretty and very silly. I shook my head and went meditating into the house. The day being wet, she could not divert herself with rambling about the park, so, at the conclusion of her morning studies, she resorted to the solace of the drawer. Her father sat reading at the table, and I, on purpose, had sought a bit of work in some unripped fringes of the window curtain, keeping my eyes steadily fixed on her proceedings. Never did any bird flying back to a plundered nest, which it had left brimful of chirping young ones, express more complete despair in its anguished cries and flutterings than she, by her single "Oh!" and the change that transfigured her late happy countenance. Mr. Linton looked up. "What is the matter, love? Have you hurt yourself?" he said. His tone and look assured her he had not been the discoverer of the hoard. "No, papa," she gasped. Ellen, come upstairs. I'm sick." I obeyed her summons and accompanied her out. "Oh, Ellen, you have got them," she commenced, immediately dropping to her knees when we were enclosed alone. "Oh, give them to me, and I'll never do so again. Don't tell papa. You have not told papa, Ellen. Say you have not. I've been exceedingly naughty, but I won't do it any more." With a grave severity in my manner, I bade her stand up. "So," I exclaimed, "Miss Catherine, you are tolerably far on, it seems. You may well be ashamed of them. A fine bundle of trash you study in your leisure hours, to be sure. Why, it's good enough to be printed. And what do you suppose the master will think when I display it before him? I haven't shown it yet, but you needn't imagine I shall keep your ridiculous secrets. For shame." And you must have led the way in writing such absurdities. He would not have thought of beginning, I'm certain. I didn't, sobbed Kathy, fit to break her heart. I didn't once think of loving him till— Loving? I cried as scornfully as I could utter the word. Loving? Did anybody ever hear the like? I might just as well talk of loving the miller who comes once a year to buy our corn. Petty loving, indeed. And both times together you have seen Linton hardly 4 hours in your life. Now here is the babyish trash. I'm going with it to the library, and we'll see what your father says to such loving. She sprang at her precious epistles, but I held them above my head, and then she poured out further frantic entreaties that I would burn them, do anything rather than show them. And being really fully as much inclined to laugh as scold, for I esteemed it all girlish vanity, I at length relented in a measure and asked, If I consent to burn them, will you promise faithfully neither to send nor receive a letter again, nor a book, for I perceive you have sent him books, nor locks of hair, nor rings, nor playthings? We don't send playthings, cried Catherine, her pride overcoming her shame. Nor anything at all, then, my lady, I said. Unless you will, here I go. I promise, Ellen, she cried, catching my breath. Oh, put them in the fire, do. But when I proceeded to open a place with the poker, the sacrifice was too painful to be borne. She earnestly supplicated that I would spare her 1 or 2. 1 or 2, Ellen, to keep for Linton's sake. I unknotted the handkerchief and commenced dropping them in from an angle, and the flame curled up the chimney. I will have 1, you cruel wretch, she screamed, darting her hand into the fire and drawing forth some half-consumed fragments at the expense of her fingers. Very well, and I will have some to exhibit to Papa, and I answered, shaking back the rest of the bundle and turning anew to the door. She emptied her blackened pieces into the flames, and motioned me to finish the immolation. It was done. I stirred up the ashes and interred them under a shovelful of coals, and she mutely, and with a sense of intense injury, retired to her private apartment. I descended to tell my master that the young lady's qualm of sickness was almost gone, but I judged it best for her to lie down for a while. She wouldn't dine, but she reappeared at tea, pale and red about the eyes, and marvelously subdued in outward aspect. Next morning I answered this letter by a slip of paper inscribed, Master Heathcliff is requested to send no more letters to Miss Linton, as she will not receive them. And thenceforth the little boy came with vacant pockets. End of chapter 21. Okay, 21 was a doozy. So, Ellen and Catherine go out on a romp exploring, and while they're out, Catherine runs into Heathcliff. And Heathcliff has this whole plan that he wants Linton and Catherine to marry. And so he reintroduces Linton. Linton is thought to have moved far, far away. But Edgar and Ellen both know that he just went over to Wuthering Heights. And so Catherine is really upset and is just chatting with him and just having a great time and is just mad at her dad for having quarreled with Heathcliff, and that's why they're not like speaking to each other, and that's why they can't see each other. And Catherine is like, well, their quarrel isn't our quarrel. Like, we can still be friends. I'll come every day, or maybe just like once or twice a week, and blah, blah, blah. And Ellen pretty much forbids it. And the next day, Catherine talks to her dad, Edgar, and says everything that has happened. And Edgar is really mad. And he says everything that has happened with Isabella, how terrible he was to her and everything like that. And he thinks that has stopped it. And Ellen thought so for a while too. But really, Catherine and Linton have been sending letters back and forth to each other and books back and forth to each other via the milkman. The milkman has been delivering their letters in secret. And Ellen found all of the letters and confronted Catherine about it, and Catherine is just so distraught because Ellen is going to go to her dad, and she's like, well, I'm just going to, like, burn them. And Catherine is like, please, please, let me just, like, keep one. And Ellen is like, no, if you keep one, I will be telling your dad. And so Ellen throws a bunch into the fire. Catherine reaches her hand in, pulls some, like, crumbles out, and Ellen threatens Catherine again, and she's like, fine. So then all of the letters are burned, and doesn't tell Edgar, because that was their deal, with the promise that Catherine would never write to Linton again. And so Ellen writes a note saying, like, to Linton, saying, no more letters. This is done. Catherine will not be receiving them. And then the milkman has come with empty pockets ever since. And that's where that chapter ended. So yeah, that's where it ends, and that's where we're gonna end tonight. We will pick up right where we left off next time with chapter 22. We are on page 223 out of 3. You would think that I would have memorized this. Out of 326. We are moving right along. We have this much to go. Pretty exciting. Pretty exciting. So yeah, that's gonna be it for today. Thank you all for being here. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you. And I 1000% appreciate your support. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. Goodbye. Goodbye. Goodbye.